Somewhere in the grey hour before first light, when the Atlantic coast of France still belongs entirely to the wind and the water, there exists a silence that few people ever hear. It is the silence of the Loire estuary at dawn, not an absence of sound, but a kind of held breath. The mist that rises from the cold channel moves slowly inland, rolling over the salt marshes and the sleeping docks, thickening as it encounters the land. And if you were standing there on that shore, in that half-darkness, you would begin to make out something extraordinary through the veil of fog. At first, only a suggestion. A vast grey form, enormous and angular, rising from the harbour basin as though the earth itself had split open to reveal something buried for generations. It is concrete, but concrete on a scale that almost defies the eye. Massive, fortress-like, its surface is worn by salt wind and decades of Atlantic weather, its edges sharp and unforgiving against the soft morning mist. The shape of it is severe, geometric, intentional, built for a purpose that has long since ended. As the fog shifts and parts, you begin to see the true dimensions of this thing. It is not a building in the conventional sense. It is something harder, something built to endure, to resist, to protect. This is the U-boat bunker at Saint Nazaire, and it has been standing on the northwest coast of France for nearly 80 years. The gulls circle above it in the half-light, their calls thin and echoing against the concrete walls, their voices the only movement in that grey and timeless air. They have known this structure their entire lives. Their ancestors knew it when it was new, when German submarines still used the pens beneath those steel doors, when the sound of diesel engines and military orders filled the vast chambers inside. The gulls do not remember that world. They only know the silence that came after, and there is something in that silence, something that speaks of history held still, of war preserved in concrete and stone, of time layered upon itself like the fog that rises with each dawn. This is where we begin, not with dates or official histories, but with the sensory truth of the place, with the mist and the gulls and the impossible mass of concrete emerging from the shoreline. Because to understand the bunker at Saint Nazaire, the concrete fortress of the Atlantic, as it came to be known, you must first stand where it stands. You must feel the weight of it. You must understand that this is not merely a ruin, but a monument to human ingenuity and human will, built in the shadow of one of history's most terrible conflicts. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of stories, to the hidden histories of the places where war left its deepest marks, where concrete and memory become inseparable, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to Fall Asleep To, the complete history of the U-boat bunkers at Saint Nazaire, concrete fortress of the Atlantic. Each night, we'll walk deeper into this fortress together, through its corridors and pens, through the minds of those who built it and those who fought against it, through the long silence that followed the war's end, through stories that are both intimate and immense, told slowly, the way memories themselves unfold, not in a rush, but layer by layer, until you understand not just what happened here, but why it matters, why it endures. Now, to understand how this vast structure came to exist on the French Atlantic coast, we must first step backward into time. We must return to Saint Nazaire as it was before the bunker, before the war transformed it from a quiet harbour town into something else entirely. Picture it as it might have been on a spring morning in the late 1930s, before the world broke apart. The town would have been modest by modern standards, a shipbuilding port of perhaps 40,000 souls, nestled where the Loire River opens into the Atlantic. The air would have smelled of salt and diesel, of fresh-cut timber and metal. The harbour would have been alive with cranes and work sites, the sound of riveting and the shouts of labourers echoing across the water. This was a working town, a town built on the sea and shipbuilding, on the rhythms of the tides and the demands of commerce. The people who lived here were accustomed to seeing large things constructed. They understood heavy industry, the way people in other places understand agriculture or trade. There was a kind of pride in that, sense that Saint Nazaire was a place where difficult, important things were made, where France's naval power was built from steel and sweat and skill. The town had its quarters where shipworkers lived in modest houses, where children ran along cobblestone streets, where the cafe owners knew their regulars by name. It had its rhythms and its routines, its seasons and its ceremonies. Life there had a texture to it, a local weight. And then the world changed. In 1940, very rapidly, everything became something different. France fell to the German invasion in a matter of weeks. The Blitzkrieg was faster and more overwhelming than any military commander on either side had anticipated. By June, the swastika flew over the French coast. The Atlantic seaboard, which had been the edge of freedom, became the Atlantic Wall, the frontier between German-occupied Europe and the open ocean beyond. Saint Nazaire, with its deep natural harbour and its shipbuilding infrastructure, suddenly became strategically invaluable to the German war machine. But why? Why would the Germans invest so heavily in a submarine base on the French coast? The answer lies in the nature of the war they were fighting, the war they believed they needed to win. From the very beginning of German military planning, the German High Command understood that they could not hope to defeat Britain through a conventional invasion across the Channel. The Royal Navy was too strong. The English Channel was too well defended. But there was another way. If German submarines, the U-boats, the underwater boats, could strangle British supply lines, they could starve Britain into surrender. Food, fuel, raw materials from America and the Commonwealth would all have to cross the Atlantic. Sink enough merchant ships, and Britain would fall not through military defeat, but through economic collapse. This was the logic behind the Battle of the Atlantic. It was not dramatic in the way that land battles were dramatic. There were no great set-piece engagements, no clear turning points visible to those fighting them. Instead, it was a grinding, persistent campaign, a kind of underwater siege that unfolded across millions of square miles of ocean. Thousands of ships were sunk. Hundreds of thousands of men died. Merchant sailors, submariners, naval personnel. The waters off Ireland and Britain and the European coast became killing fields. And the submarines that conducted this campaign needed somewhere to rest, to refuel, to repair, to receive new orders and new crews. The U-boats that operated in the Atlantic could not base themselves in Germany. The journey from the Baltic or the North Sea down to the Atlantic took weeks. The submarines would spend most of their endurance just traveling to and from their patrol areas, leaving little fuel for actual hunting. But if they could base themselves on the French coast, if they could use the deep harbours of Brest, Lorient, Saint Nazaire, La Rochelle, then they could strike much farther out into the Atlantic. They could reach convoys bound for Britain. They could prowl farther south, into waters where British defences were thinner. The strategic mathematics were clear. Control of France's Atlantic ports meant extending the reach of the U-boat arm by thousands of miles. It meant shifting the balance of the entire war. And so, very quickly after the occupation, the Germans began planning. They began looking at the ports that France had built for itself, assessing them for military use. But they realized something troubling. The ports themselves were vulnerable. Allied bombers, flying from Britain, could target the submarine docks. Naval gunfire could reach them. They needed something more than a port. They needed a fortress. They needed a structure so heavily built, so deeply protected, that no conventional bombing campaign could destroy it. No artillery, no gunfire, no weapon then available could penetrate it. In 1941, an organization called the Organisation TOT was given the task of making this dream into concrete reality. The Organisation TOT was the German state construction enterprise. a vast machinery of engineers, laborers, equipment, and materials directed toward the building of military infrastructure across occupied Europe. The fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, the bunkers and gun emplacements and concrete barriers that would line the French coast, many of these were built by the organization TORD, and so were the submarine pens. The decision was made. A massive hardened submarine pen would be built at St Nazaire. Not just a dock, but a fortified shelter, a bunker beneath which submarines could hide from the sky. The concrete fortress of the Atlantic would rise from the harbour. The scale of what was about to be attempted was almost incomprehensible. Engineers began drawing plans. Architects sketched the design. What they envisioned was something that had never been built before, a vast underground chamber with enough space to shelter submarines while they were in port. Multiple separate pens, each one capable of housing a submarine and allowing it to be repaired or serviced. Walls thick enough that bombing would not penetrate. A roof of reinforced concrete so heavy that it would have to be calculated to the exact kilogram, and all of it would have to be built while a war was ongoing, while materials were scarce, while labor was conscripted or requisitioned, while the very sky above might contain enemy aircraft. In 1941, construction began. The harbour at St Nazaire echoed with sounds that would not have been strange in peacetime, but which carried different weight now. The sound of excavation, the grinding of heavy machinery, the rumble of dump trucks carrying aggregate and materials, pile drivers hammering foundations deep into the earth, steel framework being erected, concrete being mixed in enormous quantities, tons and tons of it, delivered on site in an endless procession of trucks and barrows. The work was relentless. It continued through summer heat and winter cold, day shifts and night shifts. Men labored in the rain and fog. They worked in conditions that were often dangerous. They worked because they had no choice. And it is here that we must pause, briefly, to acknowledge something that carries weight through this entire story. The labor that built this bunker was not free labor. Some of it was conscripted French labor. Some of it was forced labor brought from elsewhere in occupied Europe. Some of it was requisitioned from local workers who had no choice but to participate in comms. The town itself, before the war redrew its map, was built on tides and work. Saint Nazaire sprawled along the Loire estuary, where the river meets the Atlantic, a place where the boundary between fresh and salt water blurs with the seasons, where the smell of brine mingles with riverbank mud and the smoke of shipyard furnaces. It was, by the standards of the 1930s, a working town with honest rhythms, the kind of place where fortune arrived not from inheritance, but from the skill of hands and the constancy of labor. The shipyards dominated everything. For nearly a century, the yards had been the heartbeat of Saint Nazaire, the Atlantic yards, the shipbuilding facilities that drew workers and their families from across the Pays de la Loire and beyond. These were not luxury liners, though some did pass through, but merchant vessels and fishing craft, the ordinary ships that carried freight and kept commerce moving between France and the wider world. The yards hummed with a particular kind of rhythm, the clang of rivets, the screech of metal on metal, the hoarse calls of foremen coordinating teams of men who had learned their trades from their fathers and grandfathers. This was a port town, true enough, but it was also a manufacturing town, a place where pride in workmanship was real and tangible. The people of Saint Nazaire, in those pre-war years, were no different from port dwellers anywhere along the Atlantic coast of France. They were merchants and sailmakers, ship's carpenters, dock hands, chandlers, and the wives and children of these men. There were schools and churches, cafes and small hotels. The town centre, modest by Parisian standards, had grown up around the harbour and the railway junction that connected Saint Nazaire to Nantes and inland France. Commerce was the language spoken most fluently here. the language of invoices and invoiced goods, of ships arriving and departing, of tides and schedules and the weather's whims. Daily life followed the patterns of water and work. Fishermen would have left in the pre-dawn darkness, their boats slipping downriver toward the open sea. By mid-morning, the yards were at full capacity, the sound of industry rising from the water like heat from pavement. Noon brought a pause. Workers would break, eat bread and cheese or soup from metal containers, perhaps share a glass of cider or weak wine in one of the yard sheds. By afternoon, the labor resumed until the light began to fail. The town then would have taken on different character, the yards quieting, shops closing, families gathering for dinner, the evening settling into a kind of weariness that was, by all accounts, comfortable and familiar. There was, one might imagine, a particular quality to evening in such a place. As the industrial noise faded, you would have heard the river more clearly, the slap of water against pilings, the creak of moored vessels, the occasional cry of gulls returning to roosting places. The smell of the estuary would have dominated, salt and weed, the faint corruption of tidal mud, perhaps the warmth of bread from neighborhood bakeries mixing with all of it. Lanterns would have come on in the streets and homes. Children would have played in the last light, their games and voices carrying across the cobblestones and narrow passages of the town. It was, by the accounts of those who lived there and remembered it later, a life of modest contentment, the contentment of a place where people knew what to expect, where the future seemed likely to resemble the past. The broader context, for those who cared to pay attention, was less settled. In those years before 1940, the political atmosphere of France was itself uncertain. The Depression had reached France perhaps more slowly than other nations, but it had arrived with considerable force. By the mid-1930s, there were anxieties in Saint Nazaire, as elsewhere, anxieties about employment, about the stability of the yards, about what was happening in Germany and Italy, and the seemingly endless instability of European politics. Yet these were anxieties that existed alongside ordinary life. People still fell in love, married, had children. Businesses still opened and closed. The rhythm of seasons continued its ancient pattern. The relationship between Saint Nazaire and the sea was fundamental to everything. The Loire estuary is remarkable, deep enough for ocean-going vessels, protected from the worst Atlantic storms by natural geography, yet intimately connected to the interior of France through the river system. It was this combination that had made Saint Nazaire a port town at all. Tides here are among the most dramatic on the Atlantic coast of France, with ranges of up to 14 meters between high and low water. This meant that the harbour was constantly transforming. Twice each day it became a different geography, and the people of Saint Nazaire learned to read these changes as automatically as they read their own language. A ship could be floating freely at high tide, resting on mud banks at low tide, knowledge that was essential to anyone who worked or lived near the water. The architecture of the town reflected its practical nature. There were no grand monuments, no elaborate facades suggesting wealth and leisure. Instead, there were sturdy warehouses, solid residential buildings, the functional structures of a working port. The most substantial buildings were often those associated with the shipyards themselves, the administrative offices, the sheds, the dry docks that had been excavated and expanded over decades of operation. The town had grown organically around these structures, adding layers as the yards themselves had expanded. What resulted was not beautiful in a conventional sense, but it had a certain integrity, the integrity that comes from form following function, from buildings and neighborhoods that were designed for living and working rather than for show. One might wonder what conversations filled those cafes and kitchens in the years immediately before 1940. What did the shipyard workers discuss over their evening drinks? Did they speak of the political situation, or did they keep to matters closer at hand? the progress of work, family concerns, the quality of the wine or beer being served. The historical record is silent on such conversations. What we can know is that the people of Saint Nazaire, like most people everywhere, lived in the present moment, attending to their immediate concerns, to the shape of the day and the demands of their work. The future, which would arrive with such violence and disruption, was not yet visible to them. It was merely one possibility among many, perhaps less likely than the continuation of things as they had always been, at least from the perspective of someone who had never known anything else. And so we find ourselves drawn toward the threshold of this vast grey structure, this monument of wartime engineering that still stands today along the Loire estuary, its concrete skin weathered by decades and salt spray. The bunker at Saint Nazaire remains one of the most formidable vestiges of the Atlantic Wall, a place where history is written not in words, but in meters of reinforced concrete, in the echoing galleries where men once worked and waited, in the careful geometry of its construction that reflected both the ambitions and anxieties of an occupying power. To understand this fortress fully, to walk through its passages in the quiet of your mind, to feel the weight of its history settle around you like the mist that rolls across the estuary each dawn, is to touch something profound about how humans build, how they fortify, and how even the most permanent structures cannot ultimately stand against time. If you find yourself curious about these kinds of places, these layers of buried history and engineering marvel, where the personal and the monumental intersect, where quiet towns harbor extraordinary stories that have shaped the wider world, then you might consider joining us here each evening. This is the kind of journey we undertake together, slow walks through the corridors of history, unhurried explorations of how war transforms a landscape, how architecture can tell us as much about human fear and ingenuity as any historical record. These nightly excursions into the concrete fortress and its nested mysteries are gathered here for those who wish to drift towards sleep, while holding in their minds the weight of real events, real people, real places that endured. The story of Saint Nazaire's submarine bunker is not one of distant abstractions or heroes at a safe remove. It is a story that lives in the particulars, in the thousands of workers who poured concrete under orders both voluntary and coerced, in the submarine crews who would eventually operate from these pens, in the families of the town who watched their port transformed into a military stronghold, in the engineers who designed a structure intended to be eternal. And perhaps most poignantly, it is a story about how even the most formidable human creations, the bunkers we build, the fortifications we raise against an uncertain world, ultimately cannot outlast the very passage of time they were meant to deny. The concrete itself has a kind of permanence, yes, but the purposes for which it was poured, the assumptions that governed its construction, the fears that animated its builders, these are all subject to the slow erosion of history itself. As you settle deeper into the evening hours, as your breathing naturally begins to slow and the day's urgencies begin to recede, there is something particularly fitting about contemplating such a place. The bunker at Saint Nazaire exists now in a kind of temporal suspension. The war for which it was built has long since ended. The submarines that once filled its pens are gone. The soldiers who guarded it have been scattered into history. And yet the structure remains, standing in the regenerated port of a town that has learned to live alongside its own past, to integrate the fortress into something new without forgetting what it once meant. This quiet coexistence between memory and renewal, between the weight of what was built and the living present that carries it forward, is perhaps the most profound lesson that such places teach us. The bunker invites a particular kind of meditation, the sort that unfolds best in the liminal hours between waking and sleep, when your mind is most receptive to layers of meaning, to the interplay of human ambition and human limitation, to the strange poetry of structures that outlive their original purpose. In the cool darkness of the evening, when external stimulation fades and your attention turns inward, there is a singular value in contemplating how a small Atlantic port became home to one of the most elaborate military engineering projects of the Second World War. How the decision to build such a fortress rippled outward through the lives of thousands. How that single decision changed the trajectory of a place for decades to come. These are the kinds of questions that settle softly in the mind as consciousness begins its drift towards sleep. Questions that do not demand urgent answers, but rather invite a kind of slow, meditative circling. What is it about fortresses that fascinates us so profoundly? Is it the sheer scale of human effort they represent? The conviction that if we only build thick enough walls, if we only engineer sufficiently complex defenses, we might achieve some form of permanence against the chaos of history? Or is it perhaps the poignancy that often attends them, the recognition that even the most imposing structures are ultimately temporary, that the anxieties they were meant to address are themselves transient, that time renders all fortifications obsolete? These questions hover in the background of our journey through Saint Nazaire's submarine pens, informing and deepening our understanding of why this particular structure was built, how it functioned, and what it means to us now, in an era when the war it was designed to serve belongs entirely to history. The story we are about to trace unfolds across 4 years of war, across the labor of thousands, across a landscape fundamentally transformed, and then, eventually, slowly reclaimed. It is a story of engineering and occupation, of strategy and human endurance, of concrete poured during wartime that somehow persists into peacetime, bearing witness to events its builders never imagined would be preserved and studied generations hence. And as you prepare to follow this narrative deeper into the evening, deeper into the quiet recesses of the fortress and its long history, know that you are embarking on a journey that requires nothing of you but your attention and your willingness to let the details accumulate, to let the images settle gently into your mind, like sediment through still water. The concrete fortress waits, patient and massive, ready to yield its secrets to those who approach it with curiosity and calm. The spring of 1940 brought a silence that no one who lived through it ever quite forgot. In May, the German armies swept westward across France, with a speed that seemed to defy the very laws of geography and time. Within weeks, what had once appeared as an invincible line of defense, the Maginot Line, that great fortress wall built at such expense and with such confidence, had been rendered almost obsolete, a monument to an older way of thinking about war that was already fading into history. The mechanized columns of the Wehrmacht, their tanks and motorcycles and trucks advancing through the spring landscape, moved with an inevitability that left the French High Command struggling to organize a coherent response. By June, the government had already fled Paris. Armistice negotiations were beginning, and the Atlantic coast of France, which had known relative peace for more than a century, suddenly found itself under the shadow of German occupation. Think of what that meant for a moment. The vast shoreline that faces westward toward England and the open ocean, where the Loire estuary widens and the Breton Peninsula curves into the sea, all of it, suddenly, was German territory. Not conquered in the way one might imagine from history books, not through decades of conflict, but in a matter of weeks. The speed itself was disorienting. Soldiers moved into towns and ports, flags changed, authority shifted, and almost immediately, German military planners began looking at the French Atlantic coast with an entirely new set of eyes. They were searching for something very specific. France's western harbours had been designed, centuries earlier, with merchant trade in mind, the great ports where ships would arrive with goods from across the world. St Nazaire, sitting at the mouth of the Loire River, was one of the largest and most important. Its harbour was deep, naturally deep, in a way that many other Atlantic ports were not. This meant that large ships could enter and exit regardless of the tides, which in this part of the Atlantic are among the most dramatic in the world. The harbour basin was also well protected by geography, sheltered from the open ocean by the curve of the coastline and the River Loire's own configuration. It was, quite simply, one of the finest natural harbours on the Atlantic coast of France. To the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, this harbour represented something close to an ideal. You see, by late 1940, the German strategic situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Britain had not surrendered after the fall of France. The expected quick conclusion to the war in the West had not materialized, and Britain, isolated as it was, still drew upon the resources of its empire: materials, oil, food, weapons arriving by ship across the Atlantic. The problem for Germany was immense. How do you strangle the supply lines of an island nation that continues to resist? The answer, or at least one answer, that military planners in Berlin were seriously considering, lay with submarines. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine had already proven itself capable of terrible effectiveness. These submarines could slip beneath the waves and strike merchant vessels with little warning. A single submarine, working patiently in the shipping lanes between America and Britain, could destroy dozens of ships and sink hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. Multiply that by 20 submarines, by 50, by 100 operating from well-defended bases on the French coast, and you could imagine strangling British resistance without the need for a successful invasion. The mathematics were attractive to German high command. All that was needed was the infrastructure: the bases, the docks, the repair facilities, the supply depots from which these submarines could operate. The Atlantic coast of France, with its deep harbours and its proximity to the British Isles, suddenly became the answer to a strategic puzzle that Berlin was trying to solve. St Nazaire, in particular, had another asset that made it almost uniquely valuable. The town possessed a large dry dock, the Fourme Joubert, an enormous enclosed basin where ships could be hauled entirely out of the water for repairs. This facility had been built in the 1920s to service the great ocean liners that were then at the height of their fame and commercial importance. Now, in German hands, it could serve a different purpose. A submarine with a damaged hull, with engines that needed overhaul, with a conning tower that had been scarred by depth charges, could be brought into that dry dock and restored to full operational capacity. This was invaluable. Submarines at sea cannot perform major repairs. They rely entirely upon their bases. So by the summer of 1940, as German occupation forces consolidated their control over the French Atlantic coast, military planners in Berlin were beginning to envision something ambitious. They saw an opportunity to transform the quiet port towns of Western France into a vast submarine empire, a network of bases stretching from the Channel to the Bay of Biscay, from which German U-boats could sortie into the Atlantic. St Nazaire was to be one of the jewels of this network, not merely a refueling depot or a repair facility, but something far more substantial: a hardened fortress. A fortress that could withstand any attack that the Allies might mount against it. The threat came not from the skies above Britain, but from the depths beneath the Atlantic waves. The moment Hitler's armies rolled into France in 1940, a quiet crisis had already begun unfolding across the ocean, one that would reshape the entire strategic landscape of the European war. You see, Germany had inherited a problem along with its newly conquered coastline. The British were islands, supplied entirely by merchant shipping that crossed the Atlantic in vast convoys, bringing food, raw materials, fuel, and the implements of war from North America. If those convoys could be strangled, if the lifeline could be severed, perhaps Britain might yet surrender without another shot fired. This was the thinking in Berlin, and it was not without logic. Germany had a weapon perfectly suited to this task, the submarine, or U-boat, as it was known in German. These vessels, growing more numerous and more sophisticated with each passing month, had already demonstrated a terrifying capability. A single U-boat, crewed by 50 men and armed with a handful of torpedoes, could sink hundreds of tons of merchant shipping in a matter of hours. Multiply that across dozens of submarines, then hundreds, and you begin to glimpse the scale of the catastrophe that seemed to loom over British waters. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it came to be known, was not a single engagement, but rather a grinding, months-long struggle that would define the entire course of the war in Europe. From 1940 through 1943, German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, searching for the fat, slow merchant vessels that carried the goods upon which Britain depended. They sank ships faster than the Allies could build them. At the darkest hour, in the spring of 1943, the losses had grown so severe that British planners began to speak quietly of the possibility that they might lose the war at sea, that the Germans might achieve through submarines what they could not achieve through invasion. But U-boats had a vulnerability, you see. They had to surface to recharge their batteries. They had to return to port for repairs, for supplies, for rest, and most crucially, they had to have bases, secure bases, from which to operate and to which they could retreat when damaged or hunted. Before the conquest of France, German submarines had operated primarily from bases along the German North Sea coast. These were distant from the primary hunting grounds, forcing U-boats to spend weeks simply traveling to and from their operating areas, time that could have been spent sinking ships. The bases were also increasingly vulnerable to British air attacks and Royal Navy patrols, which grew bolder and more organized as the war continued. When France fell, in the summer of 1940, everything changed. Suddenly, Germany controlled the entire Atlantic coast of continental Europe. The ports of the Bay of Biscay, the harbours of Brittany, the estuaries of the Loire and the Gironde, all of these became suddenly, dramatically available as potential submarine bases. Can you imagine the German admiral's perspective in those early months after victory? What had seemed like an impossible strategic problem, how to sustain a far-flung campaign against distant convoys, had transformed into an opportunity. Bases on the French coast would cut the transit time to the hunting grounds in half. Submarines could spend twice as long hunting for every sortie. The mathematics of the campaign shifted in Germany's favour, or so it seemed. St Nazaire, in particular, occupied a singular place in this new strategic calculus. The town sat at the mouth of the Loire River, one of France's great waterways, and its harbour had been developed over centuries as a shipbuilding centre. Deep water, natural protection, and modern port facilities made it ideal for submarine operations. But there was something else that made Saint Nazaire especially valuable, something that drew German planners' eyes to this particular stretch of coast with almost magnetic intensity. The harbour contained one of the few dry docks on the entire Atlantic coast, large enough to accommodate the newest, biggest German battleships. The Tirpitz, the pride of the German fleet, could be refitted there. The newest submarines could be constructed in place. This was not merely a submarine base in the making. This was a potential jewel in Germany's Atlantic strategy, a fortress of capability that could project power and sustenance across thousands of miles of open ocean. Yet ports could be bombed, facilities could be destroyed. Any installation built above ground, no matter how well fortified, remained vulnerable to determined air attack. The Luftwaffe's grip on the skies was already weakening, even in 1940 and 1941. British Bomber Command, though still relatively weak, was growing. The Americans had not yet entered the war, but their entry seemed inevitable, and when it came, the air assault would intensify beyond measure. German military planners, thinking ahead to the years of conflict they believed lay before them, knew that they needed something more than a conventional port. They needed a fortress, a shelter carved into the earth itself, or buried beneath concrete, so massive and so thick that no bomb could reach through it to the submarines resting within. This was the seed from which the bunker at Saint Nazaire would grow, not merely as a response to the threat, but as a necessity born from the very logic of submarine warfare in an age when air power had become a permanent factor in every calculation. The harbour had given Germany the advantage of distance. Now the Germans would give themselves the advantage of protection, a shelter so formidable that it would stand, in some form, nearly 80 years later, a monument to the desperation and ingenuity of industrial warfare. By the autumn of 1940, as the German occupation of France solidified across the Atlantic coast, a new and vast construction apparatus was already taking shape in Berlin. The Reich had begun to contemplate not merely the conquest of ports, but their complete transformation into fortified instruments of war. And it was from this vision that the organization TOT emerged as perhaps the most consequential instrument of industrial power the Third Reich would ever conceive. The organization TOT, or OT as it came to be known, had existed since the mid-1930s as a paramilitary construction organization, initially devoted to building the German highways, the Autobahns, that would knit the expanding Reich together with ribbons of concrete. But by 1940, its mandate had evolved into something far more ambitious and, one might say, far more troubling. Under the leadership of Fritz Todt, a man whose vision of industrial organization had captivated Hitler himself, the OT became the instrument through which the Nazi regime would impose its strategic architecture across occupied Europe. It was an organization that blurred the lines between civilian engineering and military fortification, between construction and coercion. The decision to build a hardened submarine pen at St Nazaire did not emerge suddenly. Rather, it arose from a convergence of pressures and possibilities that had been accumulating since the moment German forces reached the Atlantic coast in June of 1940. The Kriegsmarine had been quick to recognize the value of France's western ports, particularly those deep harbors that could shelter U-boats while they were refitted, repaired, and resupplied. Saint Nazaire, with its long tradition of shipbuilding and its position on the Loire estuary, offered something even more precious. It offered protection. The existing dry dock facility, the Forme Joubert, was already a marvel of French engineering, a massive caisson gate structure that could isolate vessels from the open sea while they underwent maintenance. But protection from storm and tide was not the same as protection from bombs. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, as the RAF began to develop its bombing strategy against German-occupied ports, the question became ever more urgent. How could the Kriegsmarine ensure that its precious submarines, vessels that cost vast resources to build, that required months of training for their crews, that were irreplaceable once sunk, could be kept safe while in harbour? The answer that emerged was radical in its scale and ambition. Rather than merely camouflage existing structures or build conventional fortifications, the German military planners, in consultation with the OT, conceived of something unprecedented: an enormous underground fortress, a fortress of concrete and steel that would render the submarines essentially invulnerable to aerial bombardment. The decision to begin construction at Saint Nazaire came formally in late 1940 and early 1941 as part of a broader German initiative to construct what would eventually be a network of U-boat bunkers along the Atlantic coast. Other ports, Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, Bordeaux, would receive similar treatment, but Saint Nazaire's fortress would eventually become the largest, the most heavily reinforced, the most architecturally ambitious of them all, and this distinction would make it, in the eyes of the Allies, the most urgent target. The sheer confidence implicit in this decision is perhaps worth pausing to consider. Here was Nazi Germany, having conquered France in a matter of weeks, now undertaking one of the most colossal construction projects of the war. The organization entrusted with this work had proved itself capable of marshalling resources, labor, and engineering expertise on scales that few institutions in human history had attempted. The organization taught, by 1941, had access to vast reserves of concrete, steel reinforcement, and technical knowledge. It had a system for acquiring labor, some voluntary, much of it coerced, and it had behind it the full industrial and political support of the Nazi state. One might ask, could any construction organization in any wartime situation ever achieve more? The strategic logic behind the bunker construction was sound, from a military perspective. U-boats, despite their fearsome reputation, were vulnerable vessels. Their hulls could only withstand a certain depth of water pressure. Above the surface, they were remarkably fragile. A single bomb dropped in the right location could destroy months of work and the lives of an entire crew. But a submarine nestled within a concrete pen, surrounded by meters of reinforced concrete overhead, would be shielded from almost any conventional weapon, or so the theory held. The Germans, as they began this monumental undertaking, had every reason to believe they were investing in something that would pay strategic dividends for years to come. What no one could have anticipated, in those early months of 1941, when the decision was crystallizing and the first surveys and blueprints were being drawn up, was how this fortress would become a symbol of the war itself, not merely a military facility, but a physical embodiment of the immense, almost geological weight of industrial conflict that would reshape the entire continent before the war's end. The concrete was not yet poured, the steel had not yet been delivered, but the decision had been made, and that decision would set in motion not only an extraordinary feat of engineering, but also an extraordinary tragedy of construction, a story of the hidden human cost that lay beneath every architectural triumph of the Nazi war machine. In the early months of 1941, as the winter grip began to release its hold on the Loire estuary, the harbour at St Nazaire transformed into something altogether different from the shipyard it had been. The decision made in Berlin, carried down through the chain of military command, had arrived as an imperative. Build not merely a shelter for submarines, but a fortress of concrete that could withstand anything the Allies might throw at it. And so the work began in earnest. A vast choreography of men and machinery, stone and steel, all moving toward the creation of something that would dominate the landscape for decades to come. Picture, if you will, the harbour at dawn. The mist rises from the water's surface, that peculiar grey-white vapour that clings to the estuary in the cooler months, and through it you would see them arriving. Men by the thousands, some requisitioned from the local population, others brought from across occupied France or further afield, many simply desperate for work in a time of scarcity. They came with nothing but their labour, their strength, and often their skepticism about what they were being asked to build. The French workers, in particular, moved through those early mornings with a complicated awareness of what they were constructing. A German weapon, yes, but also employment, bread, a small measure of dignity maintained through honest work in a time of occupation. The organization TOT, the German military engineering organization that oversaw much of the Reich's vast construction projects, brought with them a methodology honed across years of massive undertakings. They knew how to move earth. They knew how to pour concrete on a scale that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who witnessed it for the first time. And at St Nazaire, they would demonstrate this knowledge in full measure. The construction site itself grew into a kind of temporary city within the city. Alongside the existing shipyard infrastructure, vast wooden frameworks rose up, carefully engineered scaffolding that would support the pouring of tens of thousands of cubic meters of reinforced concrete. The sound must have been extraordinary. The constant clang of metal on metal, the rumble of heavy machinery, the percussion of hammers and pneumatic tools echoing across the water from dawn until the light failed. The air itself would have been thick with concrete dust, that fine grey powder that coated the skin and lungs of everyone who worked there, giving all who laboured in the yards a ghostly pallor by the end of each day. Can you imagine the sheer logistical complexity of it? Concrete needed to be mixed continuously, batch after batch, measured with precision to meet the exacting German specifications. Ships arrived regularly with supplies, Portland cement from across Europe, aggregate, water, steel reinforcement bars that came in enormous bundles, each one requiring placement by hand, a task of tremendous labor intensity. The concrete itself had to be transported to the pouring locations, often by hand in buckets or through systems of chutes and pumps, and then worked into place with vibrators that hummed and buzzed constantly, ensuring that every void was filled, every pocket of air was expelled from the mixture, because any weakness in the concrete could become a vulnerability, and the Kriegsmarine demanded perfection. The harbour bottom itself was being reshaped. Caisson dams were constructed to allow for the excavation and preparation of the pens where the submarines would rest. Can you perceive the immensity of these structures? 14 separate pens, each capable of holding a large Type Vic submarine, arranged in rows beneath what would become a massive concrete roof. This roof was the crucial element, the defensive innovation that gave the bunker its almost mythical reputation. It would be constructed in layers, not solid concrete throughout, but rather a sophisticated arrangement of materials designed to absorb and deflect bomb blast, to fragment incoming shells, to distribute the force of explosions across the entire structure rather than allowing them to penetrate. The thickness of this roof was extraordinary. When you read the figures, somewhere between 3 and 6 meters, depending on the source and the specific section, it becomes difficult to fully grasp what that actually means in physical terms. Imagine standing in front of a wall taller than a 2-story building, composed entirely of reinforced concrete, and knowing that this was merely the roof, merely the top layer of a much larger structure sinking deep into the bedrock beneath the harbour. The scale of ambition here was almost dreamlike, a fantasy of engineering rendered in the most brutally real material possible. The wooden forms, the temporary structures that held the concrete as it set, had to be removed once curing was complete, freeing them to be reassembled elsewhere, repurposed for the next section. This meant that the construction was a kind of rolling operation, moving through the harbour in stages, each phase dependent on the completion of the previous one. Workers became practiced at the rhythm of it, erect the forms, place the steel reinforcement, mix and pour the concrete, wait for it to set, strip the forms, move forward. Steel came into the composition of the structure in quantities that seemed almost inexplicable for a single facility. The reinforcement bars, the welded frames that would tie the entire structure together, the structural steel that formed the skeletons of the pen walls, all of it had to be placed with meticulous care. The workers who performed this task, the steel workers and structural specialists, moved among the maze of reinforcement like artisans, their knowledge of stress and strain and load distribution essential to the integrity of what was being built. And through it all, the harbour itself continued its existence. Tugboats manoeuvred among the construction sites. The existing shipyard continued some measure of its original work. The town itself, just beyond the fence and barriers that surrounded the construction zone, carried on with the strange half-life of an occupied port. But the dominance of the bunker project was undeniable. It pulled resources, labour, attention, and imagination toward itself, with an almost gravitational force. This was the future of St Nazaire, or so it seemed at the time. This concrete fortress would define the town's place in the war and in history. As the concrete began to rise from the harbour, something shifted in Saint Nazaire that no architectural drawing could capture. The bunker was no longer merely a structure taking shape. It became a presence that reached into the lives of thousands, transforming the very texture of daily existence for the people who would build it, day after day, in the uncertain landscape of occupied France. The German occupiers faced an immediate problem as construction accelerated through 1941 and into 1942. They needed labor, vast quantities of it, to pour and shape the millions of cubic meters of concrete that would become the walls and roof of the submarine fortress. The organization TOT, the military construction organization that had become Nazi Germany's instrument for transforming Europe's landscape, coordinated the effort, but the actual bodies that would do the work had to come from somewhere. And so began a quiet, relentless conscription of human effort that would leave marks far deeper than any blueprint intended. French workers formed the backbone of this labor force. Many came from the surrounding region, requisitioned by the German administration under the occupation authorities. There was little choice involved. Men of working age could be directed to the Saint Nazaire site much as they might be directed to any other essential war work, and the bunker, in the calculations of the occupying power, was nothing if not essential. Some came because they genuinely had no alternative employment. Others were specifically selected or conscripted for their skills: carpenters, masons, steelworkers, electricians. The distinction between voluntary and coerced labor often blurred in these circumstances, a grey zone that historians still gently debate when examining the records. Alongside the French workers came others whose presence reflected the darker machinery of Nazi occupation and racial ideology. Prisoners of war, both French and soldiers from other nations, were moved to Saint Nazaire to labor on the construction. For these men, the work was categorically compulsory, and the conditions reflected their status as captives rather than citizens. There were also reports, though documentation remains fragmentary and contested by historians, of Spanish Republican refugees and other displaced persons drawn into the labor pool, men whose own nations had become inhospitable, finding themselves nonetheless trapped in the machinery of German military construction far from home. The working conditions along the harbour, as concrete poured day after day, reflected the urgency that Berlin attached to the project. This was not a civilian construction site with regulated hours and safety protocols. This was a military installation being built under occupation during wartime, which meant that schedules took precedence over comfort and production took precedence over protection. Workers moved through the harbour in their thousands. One might imagine them as a kind of tidal flow, arriving before dawn, departing as dusk deepened the sky, their footsteps echoing off the wooden scaffolding and the growing concrete walls. The concrete itself became a kind of relentless presence in their working lives, mixing, pouring, spreading, smoothing. The physical repetition would have been exhausting in any circumstance, but wartime Saint Nazaire offered few mercies to exhaustion. Rations for workers were necessarily limited. This was occupied territory during a war of attrition, and feeding thousands of construction laborers was a logistical challenge that the German authorities treated with characteristic efficiency, which is to say, they fed them sufficiently to keep them working, but barely more than that. French workers who came from the town could at least return home to their families each evening, though home itself was transformed by occupation and rationing. Those who came from farther afield, or the prisoners, remained on or near the site, housed in temporary barracks that offered shelter but little comfort. What did the concrete itself demand of them? Consider the sheer scale of what was being poured. The submarine pens required enormous slabs of concrete foundation, laid true and level across the harbour's soft ground. This wasn't delicate work. It was muscular, repetitive, and intensely physical. Men wielded shovels and wheelbarrows, tamped earth, worked the wooden forms into place. As the walls began to rise, the formwork itself became a kind of vertical maze that workers had to navigate, climbing, placing, securing. The pouring of concrete in these volumes would have created its own rhythm and chaos. The roar of the mixer, the shouting of foremen, the ceaseless movement of materials and bodies. The air itself would have carried the smell of wet concrete and lime, a smell that workers would carry home in their clothes and hair each evening. There is something oddly intimate about concrete work, even under coercion. The material requires direct physical engagement. You cannot operate it remotely or with detachment. Your hands come into contact with it. You shape it. You understand its nature through your body's effort. In this sense, the workers at St Nazaire became intimate with the bunker's very substance, even as the bunker itself represented occupation, German military power, and the suppression of French sovereignty. They were, in a sense, authoring the structure through their labor, even if they would never be credited in any official record. Wartime conditions meant that work continued through seasons that would normally have curtailed construction. Winter along the Atlantic coast brings dampness and cold that seeps into concrete and into workers alike. Concrete that pours during damp, cold conditions can suffer quality issues, and so workers would have been driven harder during these periods to pour concrete at the right pace, to keep it warm enough, to maintain the schedule. And yet spring would come, then the long days of summer, during which the work could accelerate, the harbour becoming a hive of coordinated human effort, under the demanding eye of German supervisors and organisation-taught engineers. The question of exactly how many workers laboured on the St Nazaire bunker at various phases remains partially obscured by time and incomplete records. Estimates range into the thousands at peak periods, perhaps 3,000, perhaps 4,000 or more, at certain moments in the construction timeline. They would have rotated through, some staying for months, others for shorter periods. Each individual presence added to the human weight of the project, the accumulation of hours and effort that transformed the harbour. Beyond the physical conditions, there was a deeper human dimension to this labour that deserves quiet reflection. For French workers, building a German military bunker represented a complicated moral space. This was not work they had chosen, nor work that served French interests. Yet refusal carried risks and consequences that were difficult to contemplate. Some workers, as later testimony suggested, took subtle forms of resistance, turning a blind eye to structural imperfections, slowing the pace where possible, or simply channeling their frustration into the concrete itself. Others, perhaps, simply endured, treating it as temporary wartime work that had to be survived. The bunker rose not just from concrete and steel, but from these small acts of accommodation and quiet refusal, human complexity embedded in every meter of its construction. For prisoners of war, the situation carried additional layers of vulnerability. They had no authority to appeal to for protection, no civilian status to invoke. They were combatants who had been defeated and captured, now obligated to labor for their captors. The Geneva Convention offered theoretical protections, but enforcement in occupied territory during wartime was inconsistent at best. Some prisoners endured the work and survived, others did not, succumbing to illness, accident, or the general privations of wartime. Their names, often, were never precisely recorded, absorbed into the larger machinery of war, their individual fates lost to history except in fragments and oral testimony collected generations later. As the bunker rose month by month, the harbour's geography transformed around the human effort. The landscape itself became industrial, purposeful, German. And yet within that transformation lived thousands of individual experiences, the weariness at day's end, the fear of accident, the small moments of rest during a brief meal, the hope that the work would eventually finish, that normal life might resume. The concrete walls, rising higher and thicker, would ultimately come to represent not just German military engineering, but also the silenced labor of countless individuals whose names were never inscribed in official histories, whose presence was merely functional, whose effort became part of the stone itself. The structure that emerged from those years of labor and calculation was, in its essence, a geometry of survival. 14 separate submarine pens, each one a distinct concrete chamber, arranged in 2 parallel rows within the larger fortress. Think of it as a honeycomb of safety, where each cell could shelter a U-boat while keeping it isolated from the others, so that a single hit, a single catastrophe in one pen, would not cascade through the entire installation like dominoes falling in darkness. The roof itself was what gave the bunker its legendary reputation among Allied planners who studied it obsessively from across the channel. Concrete poured to a thickness of 7 meters, nearly 23 feet of reinforced solid mass stretching across the span of each pen. In some places, particularly over the central sections, the thickness reached even beyond that, a geometry of excess born from genuine fear. Layers upon layers, metal rebar interwoven in a web of steel within the stone, creating a composite structure that was, in the thinking of the engineers, nearly impervious to the aerial bombs that Allied commanders were beginning to stockpile in ever greater numbers. The concrete was mixed to specific formulas, densities calculated and recalculated, because the difference between 5 meters and 7 meters could mean the difference between a direct hit destroying the installation and a direct hit leaving it intact, still functional, still defiant. Each pen had its own entrance from the water side, where the U-boats would enter to find shelter within the fortress, and here is where the design became almost elegant in its layered thinking. The entrance to each pen was guarded by what was called a caisson gate, a massive set of steel doors that could be closed from the inside, creating an additional barrier between the underwater approach and the protected space beyond. These gates were not simple things. They were engineering challenges in themselves, designed to seal watertight and maintain the structural integrity of the entire system even under enormous pressure. Picture them in your mind as you drift, enormous steel panels that could be lowered or raised depending on the tactical situation, adding another layer of protection that made any attempt to flood the pens or force an entry an exercise in futility. The roof's overhang extended beyond the immediate pens themselves, creating a protective shell that would shield the submarines not only from direct vertical bombing, but from the blast effects of explosions occurring nearby. Curved surfaces, reinforced corners, and geometric precision throughout meant that shockwaves from nearby detonations would be deflected rather than transmitted through the structure. The Germans, learning from experience in other theaters of war, understood that destruction often came not from a direct hit, but from the violent movement of air and earth around a near miss. So they built not just a barrier, but a series of barriers, each one designed to absorb and dissipate energy rather than concentrate it. Within this fortress of concrete, the engineers had also planned for the practical realities of operating a submarine base. There were spaces for fuel storage, ammunition magazines, maintenance workshops, and living quarters. The bunker was not simply a pen, it was a complete operational facility, somewhat compressed, somewhat austere, but fundamentally self-contained. Water intake systems brought in the Loire River's waters for cooling the diesel engines. Power generation stations hummed with machinery to provide electricity to the entire complex. Communication cables ran through the structure, allowing coordination between the individual pens and between the surface command posts and the submarines themselves. The caisson system was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the entire design, though it would later become the focus of some of the most desperate thinking among the men trying to destroy it. The gates could be closed to seal the pens, and in theory, could be flooded to prevent entry if the surface above was breached. But opening and closing them required mechanisms, required power, required the kind of mechanical infrastructure that, once destroyed, would render the entire system vulnerable. The Germans knew this vulnerability existed, which is perhaps why they so heavily defended the bunker and why they were willing to pour such enormous resources into its construction and maintenance. It was not an absolute fortress. No human creation truly is, but it was as close to one as the engineering of the time could produce. The thickness of the walls themselves, not just the roof, but the sides of each pen, was also substantial, ranging from 2 to 3 meters, depending on which wall and which section we are examining. This created a space that was, in some ways, like being inside a massive concrete cocoon. The walls would muffle sound to a degree, would insulate occupants from the vibration of nearby explosions, and would provide the thermal mass necessary to keep the interior at relatively stable temperatures even as the Atlantic winter raged above and around the structure. What strikes one now, in contemplation, is how thoroughly the entire design reflected a particular philosophy of protection through layering and compartmentalization. The architects and engineers understood that any single element might fail. A roof might develop a weakness, a wall might crack under sustained bombardment, a gate might jam or become damaged. So they built multiple layers of defense, so that the failure of one system would not necessarily lead to the failure of the entire installation. This is, in essence, the logic of redundancy in warfare and engineering. Provide more than you think you need, because inevitability will demand exactly what you have provided, and then something more. The floor of each pen was also carefully engineered, sloping slightly toward drainage channels that would carry away the water that inevitably accumulated when submarines were present and fuel was being transferred and maintenance was occurring. Nothing could be allowed to accumulate. Nothing could be permitted to create conditions that might corrode the concrete or weaken the structural integrity. In the thinking of the German engineers, the bunker had to remain perfect in its function, year after year, as the war ground on outside and the Atlantic storms battered the coast. Once the first submarines began slipping into those shadowed pens in the autumn of 1941, the bunker transformed from a monument of concrete into something altogether more alive and intricate, a machine designed to nurse and harbor the instruments of the sea. The rhythms that governed life inside were unlike anything in the wider war above. Time moved differently within those cavernous halls. There was no sunrise here, no gradual dusk to mark the turning of hours. Only electric light, steady and unchanging, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the meters-thick ceiling, the world continued its daylight rotation. A submarine crew arriving for their operational period, typically a week or more in harbor between patrols, would have emerged from the slender tower of their boat into an environment that was at once reassuring and profoundly strange. The pen itself rose around them, like the ribcage of some enormous fossilized creature, its concrete walls bearing the ghost marks of the formwork that had shaped them months before. The air carried a particular quality of dampness, mixed with diesel oil and salt, a layering of scents that became as familiar to the men as the smell of their own bunks. The water beneath their boat was deep and still, almost oily in its stillness, colored a peculiar grey-green by the narrow light that filtered down from the harbor entrance far above. Have you ever noticed how water loses its vitality when enclosed? How it becomes almost a different substance altogether? The mechanical operations of the bunker followed a careful choreography that shifted with the presence and absence of boats. When a U-boat occupied a pen, the space transformed into a nested workshop. The submarine's diesel engines required constant attention, oil changes, filter replacements, inspection of the pistons and cylinders that had been stressed by days of running beneath the Atlantic swells. The torpedo tubes demanded meticulous care. Warheads were checked, the mechanisms that governed their release tested and retested, because a jammed torpedo meant a lost opportunity at sea, perhaps a lost patrol, perhaps lost lives. The batteries that powered the boat's electric motors when running submerged were charged in dedicated chambers elsewhere in the bunker, great lead-acid cells that generated heat and fumes and required constant monitoring. Maintenance crews moved through the submarine like surgeons, methodical and absorbed in their work. The sound of the bunker during these operational intervals was a particular acoustic phenomenon that the men who served there would remember for decades afterward. The concrete was so vast, so absolutely solid, that it created a resonance quite unlike any normal harbour facility. A hammer's strike on metal would echo backward and forward, creating almost harmonic layers of sound. The rumble of an engine being tested would seem to emanate from the walls themselves as much as from the boat. Voices carried in strange ways. Whispered conversations in one pen could become almost audible as a murmur several pens away, while a shouted command sometimes seemed to dissolve into the concrete rather than bounce back. The engineers and workers grew accustomed to this acoustic strangeness, but visitors often found it disorienting, as though the bunker itself possessed a voice. Is it surprising that sound behaves so differently when reflected from surfaces of this mass and composition? The human presence within the bunker was far more dense than one might imagine from the silent ruins that remain today. At any given moment during high operational periods, there might be crews from 3 or 4 different U-boats occupying their respective pens, working in overlapping shifts. Supply personnel moved constantly through the corridors, ammunition handlers pushing carts laden with shells and mines, fuel specialists coordinating the delivery of diesel oil to the boats, electricians troubleshooting equipment failures. The German Navy maintained administrative offices within the bunker's upper levels, small rooms from which officers coordinated supply schedules and operational assignments. Medical personnel stood ready in a small facility equipped to handle everything from routine illness to the traumatic injuries that sometimes resulted from compressed air accidents or machinery mishaps. Food was a particular focus of German naval administration, perhaps because they understood that the submarine service demanded a different kind of sustenance than land-based warfare. The bunker contained storage facilities that allowed fresh provisions to be maintained, and the crews received significantly more generous rations than their counterparts in the regular navy or the army. This was not mere kindness, it was calculation. A submarine at sea might spend weeks or months at a time in complete darkness and confinement, with minimal space, damp conditions, and constant danger. The men who undertook these patrols required better nutrition than normal soldiers received. Bread was baked locally. Coffee, when available, was served hot. The galley facilities within the pens allowed crews to prepare warm meals, and the smell of cooking would mix with the other odors of diesel and salt and wet concrete. The psychological landscape of the bunker was perhaps its most hidden dimension. Men working deep within this structure, separated from natural light and the normal world, developed a particular kind of camaraderie, mixed with underlying tension. The younger sailors, some barely out of their teens, found themselves working alongside skilled craftsmen and engineers who carried the weight of technological expertise and quiet authority. There was a hierarchy, certainly, but it was modified by the shared knowledge that they were all inhabitants of the same concrete world, all dependent on the same ventilation systems and the same narrow corridors. The U-boat crews themselves occupied a peculiar psychological space. They were elite sailors, yes, but they were also about to depart into conditions of extreme danger and confinement. The harbour time was both relief from patrol and preparation for its horrors. Sleep, that thing which forms the very purpose of this journey through time and memory, was a luxury managed with careful attention in the bunker. The submarines themselves offered minimal sleeping space. The hammocks strung between the torpedo tubes and along the circular walls of the pressure hull were narrow and constantly subject to the vibrations and sounds of mechanical operation. Men typically slept in 4-hour shifts, their bunks occupied by rotating crew members in a practice that became so routine it seemed almost normal. Within the pens themselves, there were rest facilities for dock workers and maintenance crews, small rooms, not unlike prison cells in their dimensions, with basic cots. The bunker never truly slept, though. Even during the quiet hours, there were always men awake, performing watch duties, monitoring systems, checking on equipment that could not be left unattended. The lighting system of the bunker, powered by generators that rumbled continuously in their own chambers, remained on around the clock, creating a peculiar sense of eternal afternoon within the pens. For the U-boat crews, who had just emerged from the absolute darkness of submerged patrol, this persistent artificial light could be almost overwhelming at first. Some men reported that it took several days for their eyes to adjust, that they craved the natural shadows that the bunker's design had eliminated. Others found comfort in the stability of this unchanging brightness, preferring it to the chaos of weather and the visible sea. The ventilation system that the engineers had designed proved both a source of pride and occasional frustration. Fresh air was drawn in through intake shafts and circulated through the massive pens by a combination of mechanical fans and natural convection through the narrow entrance. It worked reasonably well for most of the year, though during the hottest summer months, the concrete would absorb and radiate heat until the pens became oppressively warm, especially around the diesel engines. In winter, the cold from the harbour entrance would sometimes penetrate all the way to the inner pens, despite the bulk of the concrete, creating a damp chill that seemed to seep into clothing and joints. The men adapted, as men do, and the bunker became simply the conditions of their work, neither remarkably comfortable nor exceptionally harsh, but simply the concrete reality in which they existed. What might surprise you is how quickly this extraordinary environment became ordinary to those who inhabited it regularly. The mind possesses a remarkable capacity to normalize even the most unusual circumstances, and within weeks or months, the vast concrete caverns ceased to be spectacular monuments to engineering and became instead simply where one worked. The enormous curved ceiling became merely the ceiling. The elaborate system of pillars and walls became the office, the workshop, the temporary home. The echoing acoustics, which initially provoked comment and curiosity, became merely the way sound behaved in this place. The men who worked within the bunker developed their own rhythms, their own jokes, their own small traditions and practices that made the extraordinary seem mundane. In this way, one of the war's most imposing structures became just another workplace, experienced through the smaller lens of daily routine, maintenance schedules, and the simple requirements of shelter and sustenance in wartime. By the time St Nazaire became fully operational in the autumn of 1943, it held a singular place in Germany's Atlantic submarine network. Not the largest, perhaps, but strategically positioned at the mouth of the Loire, like a hinge upon which the Reich's naval dominance might still swing. The Kriegsmarine had spread its fortress pens along the coast with methodical precision, each one answering a different question about depth and accessibility and vulnerability. Lorient lay to the south, already established, already bristling with defensive works. Brest sprawled further north. La Pallice, near La Rochelle, curved into another estuary. Yet St Nazaire occupied its own calculus. The Loire ran deep enough for the largest U-boats to navigate, deep enough to reach the repair yards and the fuel depots that had been established in the months before construction began, and the mouth of that river positioned the base at an angle to the Atlantic shipping lanes that gave its submarines a strategic advantage few others could claim. The bunker's 14 pens could house perhaps 24 boats at various stages of readiness, refueling, rearming, undergoing repairs that took weeks or months. Some boats limped in scarred from depth charges. Others emerged glassy-eyed and hollow from the long Atlantic patrols, their crews pale as ghosts, their supplies nearly exhausted. In the autumn months when the weather turned brutal, when the North Atlantic became a grinding chaos of green water and wind, St Nazaire became a place of desperate rest, a sanctuary of electric light and warm food, and the knowledge that for a few weeks, at least, the constant vigilance could ease to something almost approaching sleep. The broader strategic picture was tightening, though few could have articulated it clearly at the time. Germany's U-boat campaign in the Atlantic had moved through distinct phases. The early years of near triumph, when merchant ships burned offshore and the Allies seemed almost helpless to respond. And then the terrible winter of 1942 and 1943, when new convoy tactics and improved radar and the slow accumulation of escort vessels began to turn the tide with crushing finality. Saint Nazaire was built at the moment when that tide was already running against Germany. Yet the industrial momentum of the Reich continued forward, concrete and steel pouring, as though the sheer mass of fortification could somehow arrest the momentum of history. Is it possible that the officers overseeing the bunker's completion understood, somewhere in the marrow of their professional knowledge, that they were building a monument to a war already lost? Perhaps. Uncertainty haunts the late war decisions of the Third Reich with a quiet, retrospective sadness. The base integrated itself into the daily rhythms of the port with an almost invisible gravity. Crews rotating on and off boats, supplies being inventoried and stacked, the constant low hum of diesel generators that powered the internal systems. The French workers who remained on the site, and there were many, mixed in careful silence with the German administrative personnel. Collaboration and occupation coexisted in that concrete space, unspoken, daily, routine. One might pass a German quartermaster in a corridor and nod, or hand a requisition form to a French supervisor, and in those small transactions the occupation renewed itself without fanfare or cruelty, merely as the mechanical grinding of things as they were. What made Saint Nazaire distinct among the Atlantic bases was partly geology and partly circumstance. The Loire's tidal range was dramatic. The difference between high and low water could exceed 40 feet. This created both advantage and vulnerability. A boat could enter on the tide and nestle into the pens, but damage to the outer gates, to the caisson mechanisms that sealed the boats inside, could strand vessels or trap them at awkward angles of the tide. The engineers had accounted for this in their design, yet the margin of safety was narrower than at some other bases. Saint Nazaire depended more precariously on the integrity of its external defences, on its gates and its concrete apron, on the machinery that governed access and egress. In a sense, the entire operation was threaded through with a kind of dependence on mechanism, on the constant functioning of systems that would never, over the course of the war, have the luxury of rest. The boats themselves arrived and departed in a rhythm that had become terrifyingly predictable by 1944. A U-boat would slip into port after 6 weeks or 8 weeks at sea, the men aboard speaking in whispers, their beards grown long, their eyes holding that particular exhaustion that belongs only to submarine crews. The submarine pens were not comfortable. They were damp and echoing, with that peculiar smell that concrete absorbs from salt water and diesel fuel and human sweat. But they were safer than the open Atlantic, and safety, by that point in the war, had become an almost impossible luxury. How much awareness existed in Saint Nazaire about the strategic stakes of the base itself? The officers commanding the Kriegsmarine flotilla certainly understood the calculus that if Saint Nazaire could be rendered unusable, if its repair facilities were destroyed, or its caisson gates were damaged, the U-boat war in the Atlantic would lose a critical node, a place where boats could be restored to fighting readiness. This knowledge itself became a kind of weight, a burden that informed every decision about defensive measures, about the positioning of anti-aircraft guns, about the protocols for rapid evacuation. The bunker, in other words, knew itself to be important enough to kill for, important enough to die defending. That self-knowledge shaped the character of life within it, even when outwardly life seemed merely routine and grey. What began as whispers in intelligence reports soon became the central preoccupation of Allied planners across the Atlantic. By late 1941, as the concrete rose from the St Nazaire harbour, British naval intelligence had already begun assembling a picture of German intentions along the French coast. They watched the construction sites with a kind of distant dread, understanding that somewhere beneath that expanding web of fortifications, a submarine fleet was taking shape. The question that kept strategists awake was not whether the Germans were building these pens, but how thoroughly they might be building them. The intelligence picture emerged slowly, in fragments. Photographs from reconnaissance aircraft became the primary language of understanding. High-altitude photographs, taken at considerable risk by RAF pilots pushing their Spitfires and Mosquitoes toward the French coast, showed the harbour at Saint Nazaire transforming month by month. The images were grainy, often obscured by cloud cover, but they revealed the truth in their way. Concrete slabs appeared like pale rectangles against the darker earth. Walls rose in geometric precision. The scale became apparent only through careful measurement and cross-referencing with known objects. A dock building here, a railroad track there. What emerged was a structure unlike anything previously encountered. The roof thickness alone, as intelligence estimates gradually refined themselves, suggested something approaching invulnerability. The British Naval Intelligence Service, combined with what information could be gathered from the Free French and from agents embedded in occupied France, built a composite understanding of the threat. Some details came from workers themselves, men who had laboured on the construction and who later escaped or were captured. Their accounts, given in debriefing rooms in London or Bletchley, painted a picture of methodical German engineering and seemingly limitless resources being poured into fortifying these Atlantic bases. The penned submarines were not merely hidden, they were being protected by something that resembled more a military fortress than a conventional port installation. There was a particular concern that haunted the planners. The dry dock at Saint Nazaire, that extraordinary facility with its massive gates, offered the Germans something unmatched anywhere else along the Atlantic coast. Larger vessels could be serviced there, damaged U-boats could be hauled up for repair. The dock itself was a vulnerability, yes, but also the very thing that made Saint Nazaire strategically invaluable. If that dock could somehow be destroyed or rendered unusable, the entire port's utility would be severely compromised. This thought, barely articulated at first, would eventually grow into something far more concrete and dangerous. The reconnaissance efforts intensified through 1941 and into 1942. Photo intelligence became more sophisticated. Analysts studied not just the physical structure, but the patterns of activity within the harbour. Submarine movements were tracked when possible. Supply ships were noted. The frequency of departures and arrivals provided clues about how many boats were being serviced and how quickly they were being turned around. The Germans had succeeded in creating something formidable, yet the very attempt to understand its capabilities meant that Allied planners were forced to confront not just its existence, but its implications for the conduct of naval warfare. What the photographs and intelligence reports could not fully reveal was the psychological dimension of the structure. The bunker itself, once completed, would have a presence that transcended its mere technical specifications. To the submarine crews who sheltered within it, it would feel like an impregnable sanctuary. To the workers who maintained it, it would be a monument to German industrial capability. To the townspeople of Saint Nazaire who lived in its shadow, it would be an immovable fact of occupation. But to the Allied planners staring at those grainy reconnaissance photographs, it represented a puzzle with no obvious solution. How do you destroy something that seems, by every calculation and measurement, designed to withstand destruction? The vulnerability assessments that began to take shape in intelligence offices suggested something both sobering and intriguing. The bunker's roof might be strong enough to resist conventional bombing, or so the calculations suggested. But what if the attack came not from above, but from the harbour itself? What if, instead of trying to penetrate that massive concrete shield, the objective was to attack the dock installations that made the base functional? This subtle shift in thinking, from direct assault on the fortress to more lateral approaches, would eventually lead down a path towards something far more audacious than conventional air raids. Meanwhile, in the ports of southern England, among the naval command centres and the special operations planning rooms, a different kind of thinking was beginning to crystallise. The threat posed by St Nazaire was becoming sufficiently acute that it seemed to demand a response beyond intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. The U-boats operating from that base were taking a toll on Atlantic convoys. Each month of the fortress's operation represented countless tons of Allied shipping lost, men drowning in cold northern waters, supplies that never reached Britain or North Africa. The mathematics of the war at sea were brutal and unforgiving. Something would have to be done. The first tentative proposals for action began to emerge from this sense of urgency. They were vague at first, ideas rather than plans, suggestions that crystallized around a central question: could a target as heavily defended as Saint Nazaire actually be vulnerable to anything other than overwhelming force? And what might such force look like? The reconnaissance photographs continued to arrive week after week, month after month, documenting a structure that grew more complete and more formidable with each passing season. The challenge was becoming clearer, but so was the terrible calculus that any attempt to neutralize the threat would demand. An operation against Saint Nazaire would not be a simple matter. It would require ingenuity, sacrifice, and a willingness to attempt something that had never been tried before. Yet even as the bunker hardened month by month, its walls thickening against what was still only a theoretical threat, men in London were already conceiving something that would test those defences far sooner than anyone expected. The strategic calculus was straightforward enough. The dry dock at Saint Nazaire, the Four Méclus, was the only facility on the entire Atlantic coast capable of hauling out and repairing the largest German warships. The Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck, had already proven how a single capital ship could paralyze an entire fleet. But if that dry dock were destroyed, the Germans would lose a precious tool. A ship damaged in the Atlantic would have nowhere to go for months, perhaps longer. This logic, combined with something else, a particular kind of audacity that only emerged in certain moments of warfare, led to the birth of Operation Chariot, a raid so improbable in its conception that some who heard it first thought it must be a fantasy. The plan formed gradually through late 1941 and into early 1942, refined in quiet rooms where risk was weighed against necessity. The operation would require a ship, an old one, expendable, but large enough to be noticed, to draw fire. That ship would be filled with high explosive and steered directly into the dry dock's main gates, which were themselves ancient and massive structures that had served the port for decades. Then, commandos would land under cover of naval bombardment, secure the objective, and when the moment came, the ship itself would detonate, destroying the gates beyond any hope of repair. It was the kind of scheme that belonged more to adventure fiction than to the measured world of military planning. And yet, there was a cold logic to it that appealed to those who saw the Atlantic War slipping from their grasp. The vessel chosen was HMS Campbelltown, a destroyer of the American Caldwell class, already obsolete by 1942 standards. She had been transferred to British service under the Lend-Lease Agreement and was now considered suitable for sacrifice. Her hull was reinforced with concrete behind the bridge. Her superstructure was modified to resemble a German ship of the same class, and her entire forward section was packed with 10 tons of high explosive. The plan was almost baroque in its precision. Approach the harbour disguised as a damaged German destroyer returning to port. Fool the defenders long enough to close the distance, then strike hard and fast before resistance could organize. The commandos would come in fast small craft, hidden from view as the Campbelltown made its run. They would swarm ashore, overwhelm the guards, secure the machinery that operated the gates, and hold the position long enough for the demolition parties to set charges on the gates themselves and other critical structures. Everything depended on surprise, on that first glorious moment when confusion would reign and the defenders would hesitate. It depended too on the caliber of the men selected for this work, soldiers drawn from the commando units training in Scotland, men who had volunteered for raids, who understood that such operations were rarely conducted with any assurance of success. The date was set for late March 1942, and the night of March 27th approached with the inevitability of tide. The force that gathered in the channel was modest in appearance. The Campbelltown herself, a motor gunboat to serve as headquarters, 16 fast coastal assault craft, and the escort vessels that would lay down covering fire. On paper it seemed almost too small, a raiding party rather than an invasion force. But that was the essence of the plan. Stealth was armor, speed was protection. The convoy crept down the channel and out toward the Bay of Biscay, and as darkness fell, men tried to rest in the cramped quarters of their vessels, knowing what dawn would bring. The mouth of the Loire was reached in the deep night of the 28th, and the convoy prepared to make the approach. The disguise of the Campbelltown was not perfect. Those who looked closely could see she was not quite what she claimed to be. But in the darkness and confusion, close scrutiny was the last thing anyone expected. The ship's company had rehearsed their German phrases, their responses to challenges. The signalers stood ready to flash false authentication codes. As they entered the estuary, the concrete fortress rose above the water, dark and silent, its long pens descending into the earth like a fortress from another age. The searchlights, when they came on, would rake across the water with a cold intensity. The Germans did challenge them. A coastal defense vessel fired warning shots, and in those moments the audacity of the plan revealed itself fully. The Campbelltown's guns replied, and the firing exploded across the harbour, sudden and shocking in the pre-dawn hours. The German defenders, caught off guard, fired back wildly at what they believed was a damaged German ship in distress, which only added to the chaos. The commandos in their fast craft surged toward the quays, their weapons ready, and as the Campbelltown drove forward with terrible purpose, she struck the massive gates of the dry dock with the force of a ship moving at 12 knots. The impact shook the structure of the dock itself, and for a moment, in that collision, everything hung suspended. The commandos poured ashore into a maelstrom of fire and confusion. The darkness, the explosions, the shouting in 2 languages, all of it combined into something nightmarish and paradoxically useful. They moved through the harbour with practiced precision, securing positions, clearing obstacles, setting charges on machinery and infrastructure. Some men fell, killed or wounded. Others found themselves in hand-to-hand struggle with German defenders suddenly woken from sleep or drawn from their posts by the alarm. But they held. They held the dock, and they held the positions they had seized. The Germans, expecting an invasion perhaps, concentrated their response toward the harbour entrance rather than the dock itself. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that extraction would not be simple. The supporting naval vessels were taking heavy fire from shore batteries. The fast craft that were supposed to pick up the commandos were coming under intense fire themselves. Some were sunk or damaged. The withdrawal became a retreat, and the retreat became something closer to a desperate escape. Yet even in that desperate moment, the primary objective had been achieved. The commandos had done what they came to do. They had set charges on the gates and on the turntable that was supposed to turn ships within the dock. The Campbelltown's explosive was set to detonate on a delayed fuse, and as the sun began to rise on March 28th, the surviving commandos and sailors fought their way back out to sea, leaving behind a harbour in confusion and a ship that stood as a testament to extraordinary risk. When the Campbelltown exploded hours later, the blast tore through the dry dock's gates with a force that made the entire harbour reverberate. The gates that had served the port since the 19th century were simply obliterated, destroyed so thoroughly that repair would take months. The turntable was shattered. The facility that the Germans had relied upon was rendered useless. The cost, when it was tallied, was severe. Of the 620 men who participated in Operation Chariot, nearly 250 were killed or missing, lost in the harbour, or captured and later executed by their captors. The Germans, enraged at the audacity of the attack and the destruction it had caused, treated the commandos with particular harshness. But the damage to the dry dock proved to be almost permanent. The Germans rebuilt it eventually, but it would never again be available to them with the same reliability, and the loss of the facility rippled through their naval planning for the remainder of the war. Inside the concrete fortress of Saint Nazaire, in the deep bunker pens where the submarines rested, the sound of the explosion carried through the stone and concrete. The crews heard it, the engineers heard it, and in that moment, the bunker's true purpose became more urgent, more vital. The submarines could no longer rely on the greatest repair facility on the Atlantic. They would need to be more self-sufficient, more careful. The dry dock's destruction was symbolic and practical both. It meant that the port itself had become vulnerable, that even the greatest engineering could not protect everything. The fortress stood, the bunker endured, but the war had a new clarity to it now, a new edge of precariousness that no thickness of concrete could entirely dispel. The dawn that broke over Saint Nazaire on the 28th of March, 1942, was unlike any other the port had seen. The sky had lightened from black to a bruised purple, and in that thin, uncertain hour between night and day, the first reports began to arrive at the German command posts, each one more unsettling than the last. The destroyer Campbelltown, now a twisted mass of burning metal lodged against the gates of the Normandy dock, had done something that no bombardment, no calculated assault from the air, had managed to accomplish. It had breached not the physical structure of the fortress, but the illusion of its invulnerability. The seaward face of the dock had erupted just after 4 in the morning. The tons of explosives packed into the Campbelltown's hull had detonated with a force that shattered the great lock gates, those magnificent caisson doors that had been engineered to contain the Atlantic's tidal flow and the passage of the largest warships. The eastern gate, that intricate mechanism of steel and concrete, had simply ceased to function as the Germans understood function. Where once there had been a precise operational system, there was now only twisted metal, concrete dust, and the slow realization among the German engineers that the facility's primary purpose, to dock and service the largest German surface vessels, to provide refuge for the Admiral Scheer or her sister ships, had been rendered impossible, perhaps forever. And yet, in those early morning hours, as smoke still curled from the harbour and the sun began its climb above the estuary, the human cost of the night became the focus of a different kind of accounting. The British and Norwegian commandos who had poured ashore in the darkness had paid dearly for their success. Of the approximately 600 men who had embarked on the raid, some 250 had been killed, wounded, or were missing in the shallow waters and streets of Saint Nazaire. Among them were sailors from a dozen ships, marines who had trained for weeks for this single night, officers whose names would eventually be recorded in the careful archives of naval history, but whose faces and voices had already begun to fade into the mist of the estuary. The survivors who were captured that morning faced an uncertain fate. Some were interrogated immediately, their accounts of the raid gathered by German intelligence officers who could scarcely believe what they were hearing. A deliberate ramming attack? A suicide mission? The very concept seemed almost medieval in its simplicity and ferocity, as if naval warfare had suddenly reverted to some earlier age of direct confrontation and sacrifice. The Germans, with their precision and their engineering logic, had planned for countless contingencies, yet they had not truly planned for this kind of courage, or perhaps this kind of desperation. Within the fortress itself, even as the demolitions teams worked to assess the damage, and even as the first systematic efforts began to clear the wreckage, there was a subdued quality to the work. The mood was not one of panic. The Wehrmacht and its supporting organizations were too disciplined for that. But there was something like a quiet, spreading unease. The logic of the bunker had been tested not by superior firepower or technical innovation, but by human will. The fortress had been designed to withstand bombing campaigns, to weather the expected assaults of conventional warfare. But what did one do against an enemy willing to sacrifice 600 men to destroy a single dock? The ripple of this realization spread outward from Saint Nazaire with surprising speed. In Berlin, in the High Command's offices where strategic decisions were made, the raid was discussed with a kind of grim respect mingled with frustration. The Kriegsmarine was already stretched thin, already losing vessels at a rate that seemed unsustainable, already facing the slow grinding pressure of British naval superiority and American industrial capacity. Now, one of their most crucial Atlantic bases, one of the few installations capable of servicing large warships in the Western Theater, had been rendered useless at least temporarily. How long would repairs take? Weeks? Months? And during that time, what risks would German surface vessels have to run if they needed to operate in Atlantic waters? In London, by contrast, the mood was one of vindication tinged with sorrow. The operation, which had been conceived as a desperate gamble, had succeeded beyond what many had dared hope. Yes, the cost had been high, too high, in the view of those who had known some of the men involved. But the destruction of the Normandy dock gates meant something larger than the mere loss of a facility. It meant that the Germans were not invincible, that their great fortresses could be penetrated, that the tide of the war, which had seemed to flow so relentlessly in their favor just a few months earlier, might be beginning to turn, however imperceptibly. The people of Saint Nazaire, meanwhile, woke to a changed landscape. The town had been the scene of a pitched battle during the night. Houses near the harbour had been damaged or destroyed. French civilians, some of whom had sheltered in cellars and bunkers of their own, emerged to find their port transformed once again, no longer the scene of a successful German fortress, but now the site of what would be remembered as one of the most audacious commando raids of the entire war. In the weeks and months that followed, the damage to the dock was slowly assessed. The Germans eventually concluded, somewhat to their own surprise, that permanent repairs would be impractical. The dry dock would remain inoperable for the remainder of the war. No Admiral Scheer, no Admiral Hipper, no surface raider of any significant tonnage would ever again use the Normandy dock for repairs or maintenance. Instead, the base would be repurposed, its infrastructure converted to serve the U-boats whose bunker, that great concrete fortress, still stood intact across the harbour, still functional, still a destination for submarines and their crews. But there was a psychological shift that had occurred on that March morning. something that cannot be measured in yards of concrete or tonnage of steel. The fortress at St Nazaire had proven itself vulnerable to human ingenuity and sacrifice. It was a vulnerability that would not be lost on Allied planners in the months to come, a knowledge that would inform strategy and shape the planning of future operations. The bunker itself stood undamaged, its 14 pens still ready to shelter submarines, its roof still proof against the expected bombardments. And yet something had changed. The aura of invincibility had been pierced, and from that small puncture wound in German confidence, the full weight of Allied determination would eventually begin to pour. From across the Channel, in offices and war rooms where maps were pinned with coloured thread and photographs analysed under magnifying glass, the Allies had watched St Nazaire's concrete fortress rise. Intelligence reports filtered in steadily. Reconnaissance flights brought back images of the pens taking shape, the roof thickening, the harbour transforming into what would become one of the most formidable submarine bases on the Atlantic. And with each report came a deepening certainty. This bunker had to be destroyed, not damaged, destroyed utterly, rendered useless, collapsed into the harbour mud from which it had emerged. The challenge, however, was almost breathtaking in its scale. The bunker's roof, that vast ceiling of interlocking steel and concrete, measuring some 14 feet thick in its deepest places, sitting atop massive supporting columns, had been engineered with a singular, almost fanatical purpose: to survive, to withstand the heaviest bombs that aircraft could carry across the ocean. The Germans, having watched their own cities burn from the skies, understood that conventional bombing was the Allies' preferred language, and so they had answered in concrete. By 1943, Saint Nazaire had become a priority target for the Royal Air Force's strategic bombing campaign. The mathematics were straightforward, or so the planners believed. Enough tonnage delivered accurately enough, from a high enough altitude, and eventually the structure would fail. Strength, after all, has limits. Concrete cracks, steel fatigues, stone surrenders. The first serious raids came in the spring of that year, and they grew heavier through the summer and autumn. The bombers approached in tight formations, their engines a distant drone that gradually became a roar, that sound which made every person in Saint Nazaire who heard it understand that the sky itself was about to become violent. The flak batteries around the bunker responded, bursts of light puncturing the darkness, streaks of tracer fire reaching upward, and yet the bombers pressed on, their bomb bays opening, thousands of tons of high explosive beginning their fall toward the fortress below. The raids came not once or twice, but dozens of times over the following years, wave after wave. 4-engined Lancasters, Stirlings, Halifaxes, each capable of carrying a bomb load that could obliterate an entire street, all converging on the same target. The nearest buildings shuddered, windows across the town shattered outward, the very earth itself seemed to heave and settle. And yet, somehow, when the smoke cleared and the reconnaissance photographs were analysed, there it stood, the bunker, still there. The realization came slowly, but it came with a kind of terrible certainty. The roof was holding. Bomb craters bloomed around it like pockmarks. The harbour infrastructure scattered in twisted metal, but the roof itself, that monumental grey ceiling, bore the punishment like skin-bearing scars. Cracked, perhaps, its surface blackened and torn, but fundamentally, structurally, still intact, still a roof, still sheltering the pens and their submarines within. There is something deeply unsettling about encountering a thing specifically designed to resist your most powerful tools. It is not quite despair, but something neighbouring it, a recognition of the gap between ambition and capability. The Royal Air Force had concentrated firepower on this single structure that many nations have never experienced. Thousands of tons, hundreds of sorties, dozens of crews who did not return. And the bunker endured. The engineers and strategists puzzled over this. What could one do against a target that refused to break under sustained bombardment? Some advocated for even heavier bombs, a new generation of weapons still in development. The Lancaster's famous tallboy, designed by Barnes Wallis, was considered a potential answer. A bunker-busting bomb, sleek and heavy, meant to penetrate deep before detonating. But even these, when they fell on Saint Nazaire, seemed to be absorbed rather than accepted as defeat. The bunker's engineers had calculated well. One must imagine the experience of those who sheltered inside during the raids. The sound alone would have been extraordinary, not the distant rumble of explosions in the city above, but the immediate crack of bombs striking the very roof overhead, a sound that must have reverberated through the concrete like the tolling of an enormous bell. Each strike sent a tremor through the pens, through the submarines resting there, through the men who maintained them. And yet, day after day, the bunker held. The lights still worked, the workshops still functioned, the pens remained dry. It became almost an article of faith among those inside, perhaps, that this place was simply impervious, that some combination of engineering precision and German determination had created a sanctuary in the midst of the war. The civilian population of Saint Nazaire experienced a different sort of siege, of course. They lived above and around this fortress that could not be destroyed, which meant that bombardment would continue indefinitely. The raids would not stop when the bunker fell, because the bunker would not fall, and so the raids continued. Neighborhood after neighborhood transformed into ruins. Entire blocks became rubble. The schoolhouses and apartment buildings, the cafes and shops, the homes where children had been born and families had lived for generations, all of this was pulverized in the effort to crack a concrete ceiling that refused to crack. There is a peculiar cruelty in that arithmetic. Thousands of civilians suffered and died, not in direct service to the bunker's defense, but simply as unavoidable neighbors to it. The bunker's survival meant their continued suffering. One wonders whether, in some of the quieter moments deep within those pens, any of the German officers considered this exchange, what had been preserved and what had been lost in the process of that preservation. The bombing campaign continued, wave after wave, through 1943 and into 1944, and it remained unanswered. The bunker simply would not yield to air power, and in that refusal, it came to represent something larger, a monument to a form of German engineering and determination that seemed almost too solid to accommodate defeat. The concrete remained. The war continued. The pens below remained functional, still sheltering submarines, still serving the Kriegsmarine's dwindling operations in the Atlantic. It would take something other than bombs falling from the sky to finally silence this fortress. That answer, when it came, would arrive not from above, but from the ground itself, and from a different kind of human determination altogether. And yet, while the concrete fortress rose around them, the people of Saint Nazaire itself lived in a peculiar kind of shadow, not the shadow of the bunker itself, but of everything it meant. By the time the submarine pens were fully operational in 1943, the town had already endured 3 years of occupation, and the presence of the bunker did not ease that burden. It only deepened it, made it more visible, more inescapable. The occupation of Saint Nazaire began, as it did for so much of the Atlantic coast, in the summer of 1940. German troops arrived after the fall of France with remarkable swiftness, taking control of the port facilities and the shipyard that had once been the town's great pride and livelihood. What happened next was something that spread across occupied France like a slow settling of ash. The methodical reorganization of civilian life under military authority. The morning routines changed. Curfews arrived. Travel between towns required permission. Young men began to disappear. conscripted or requisitioned for work on the great fortification projects that were spreading along the coast. For the working people of Saint Nazaire, the construction of the U-boat bunker was both an opportunity and a trap. The organization TOT required vast numbers of laborers, and those who could work found employment, if employment under military occupation can be called such a thing. They came to the work sites each morning, the dockyards echoing with the sounds of pneumatic drills and the endless tumble of concrete trucks. Some were volunteers, drawn by the promise of work and relative food security in a period of deepening scarcity. Many more were conscripted through the Service du Travail Obligatoire, the forced labor system that would eventually send hundreds of thousands of French workers into German service. The boundary between willing and forced labor, even in the accounts of those who lived through it, was often blurred by hunger, by the need to feed children, by the simple arithmetic of survival. The concrete pause happened in all seasons. In the winter of 1941 and 1942, workers endured cold that seeped into their bones as they guided tons of material into place, their hands growing numb around tools, their breath visible in the grey Atlantic air. In summer, the heat reflected off the work surfaces could be overwhelming, and the dust from the aggregate hung in the air like a constant fog. There were injuries. The records that survive mention falls, crushing accidents, men caught in machinery or buried under shifting materials. Some deaths went unmarked in any formal record at all. The pace of work was relentless because the military priorities were unforgiving. The bunker had to be built. The war had to be won. Individual suffering was a cost that could not be allowed to slow the project. The civilian population of Saint Nazaire, meanwhile, watched this transformation of their town with a complex mixture of emotions that rarely appears in any single testimony but threads through many. There was, for some, a kind of dark pride in the sheer scale of engineering happening on their doorstep, even as that same engineering marked them as enslaved to a foreign power. There was fear of the Gestapo, which had a presence in the town, fear of informants, fear that any careless word could bring consequence. There was hunger. The food rations allocated to French civilians in occupied territories were strictly controlled, calculated to be just barely sufficient to maintain life, but never quite enough to thrive. Families grew thin. Children learned to go to bed with an awareness of scarcity that shaped their dreams and their waking thoughts. But perhaps the deepest anxiety came from understanding what the bunker itself represented. Everyone in Saint Nazaire knew what was being built. The Germans made no real secret of it. The submarine pens were a fortress designed to protect the U-boats that were sinking ships in the Atlantic, killing men in the dark water, strangling Britain. To harbour those submarines, to feed them, to shelter them, meant that Saint Nazaire had become a legitimate military target, and as the war deepened and the tide in the Atlantic began to shift, that awareness became more than theoretical. It became a reality that arrived, first with reconnaissance flights, then with warning sirens, then with bombs. The air raids on Saint Nazaire began in 1942, tentative at first, reconnaissance bombing, as the Allies sought to understand the nature of what the Germans had built, but they intensified as the war progressed. The early raids were not primarily aimed at the bunker. No bomb could penetrate that roof, but at the facilities around it, the docks, the supply lines, the infrastructure of the port. Yet precision bombing, even when aimed at military targets, spreads its effects widely. Buildings in the town centre were struck. Shops disappeared in plumes of smoke and ash. Entire streets were reduced to rubble. The civilian casualties accumulated slowly at first, then more rapidly as the bombing campaigns intensified. The people of Saint Nazaire developed the particular knowledge that comes to those who live under bombardment. They learned the sound of approaching aircraft, the different timbres of different bombing raids. They learned which basements were safest, which streets were most dangerous. They developed a kind of weary expertise in destruction. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the sirens, some people were always caught outside when the bombs fell. Some were in basements that collapsed. Some simply ran the wrong direction in moments of panic. The living began to outnumber the dead only in terms of numbers. In terms of the emotional and spiritual weight they carried, the dead seemed to grow heavier. One particular aspect of life under bombardment for civilians deserves its own reflection. There existed, in occupied St Nazaire, a strange geography of dread. The bunker itself was not bombed with any success, its roof proving impervious to the heaviest attacks. Yet the civilians lived around it, beside it, within sight of it. This meant that the town itself became, in a sense, a protective barrier for the bunker. The Allies could not bomb the fortress effectively, but they could bomb everything around it. They could destroy the town that sheltered those who served the fortress, that provided its labor, that fed its infrastructure. It was a grim mathematics, and every civilian who died in the bombing raids died in a certain sense as a consequence of the bunker's existence. Not killed by the bunker itself, but killed because of it, because their town had been transformed into something essential to German military power. As 1943 became 1944, the bombing intensified further. The war in the Atlantic was reaching a crucial phase. The U-boats were being hunted more effectively by the Allies. St Nazaire, as one of the primary pens still functioning in German hands, became a target of heightened priority. The civilians endured the raids with the kind of resilience that comes not from strength, but from the simple absence of any alternative. What else could they do? They could not leave the town in any organized way. The occupying authority controlled all movement. They could not resist directly. The Gestapo was present and efficient. They could only wait, endure, hope that when the next siren sounded, when the next wave of bombers came over the horizon, they would survive. And as they endured, the bunker stood above and around them, grey and monumental, impervious to the forces that were destroying the town around it. It was, in a way, the most permanent thing in their lives, more permanent than their homes, more assured of survival than they were themselves. The fortress had been built by their labor and their suffering, and now it stood as a kind of monument to that suffering, offering protection to no one but the submarines within and the German military that controlled them. For the civilians of St Nazaire, the concrete fortress was not a shelter. It was a weight they bore on their shoulders, a reminder every day of occupation and powerlessness and the terrible proximity of history to ordinary life. By late summer of 1944, the war's momentum had shifted irrevocably against Germany, and yet in one small corner of the Atlantic coast, in and around the concrete fortress at St Nazaire, a strange pocket of resistance would form and persist, almost forgotten, into the spring of the following year. The broader liberation of France moved with gathering speed. Paris fell in August. Brittany was being swept back into Allied hands. The tide of history seemed to be moving decisively eastward, toward Germany itself, and yet the German garrison at St Nazaire, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of simple military discipline, or perhaps because the bunker itself had become a fortress mentality that could not be easily relinquished, chose not to surrender, not to retreat, but to hold. Picture the slow autumn of 1944 settling over the Loire estuary. The U-boat pens, once thrumming with the activity of submarine maintenance and resupply, had fallen silent months earlier. Most of the operational vessels had been withdrawn to other bases or lost at sea. The crews had departed. The strategic purpose of the fortress had become historical rather than present. And yet the German forces, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers, estimates vary softly in the records, remained, dug in behind the very walls they had built, the concrete that was meant to shelter submarines, now sheltering the last defenders of this corner of occupied France. What is it that keeps a garrison in place when the war around it has already moved on? Perhaps it is the weight of command, the last orders given with conviction in a time when conviction was becoming scarce. Perhaps it is the fortress itself, the sense that such a place, so heavily invested, so carefully defended, could not simply be abandoned. The Allies, for their part, faced a choice. St Nazaire, isolated now from the main German defensive lines, cut off from meaningful reinforcement or resupply, posed no immediate threat to the broader liberation effort. The bunker's roof had proven impervious to bombing. Its walls could withstand conventional siege weapons. To take it by storm, as they had learned from Operation Chariot and the months of bombardment that followed, would be costly in lives. And so a different strategy emerged, one born of patience rather than urgency: the blockade, the siege, the slow pressure of containment. Allied forces established positions around Saint Nazaire in September and October, gradually tightening the noose, cutting the garrison off from the rest of German-held territory, limiting supply lines, establishing a perimeter that was less a wall of assault and more a gentle, inexorable closing of possibility. For months, this curious standoff persisted. Winter came early to the Loire estuary in 1944, and the cold grey rains began their patient work of dampening not just the landscape, but the spirits of men on both sides. The German garrison, cut off, without hope of relief or reinforcement, faced a slow diminishment. Food became scarcer, supplies dwindled, communication with higher command grew irregular, and finally almost ceased. One can imagine the weight of those months, the waiting, the cold, the knowledge that the war had passed them by, that they were now simply there, holding a fortress that no longer needed to be held, defending a position that had become almost abstract in its irrelevance to the larger conflict. Do you wonder, as historians sometimes do, what kept them there? Was it loyalty to an ideology that was failing? Was it the simple weight of military order, the fact that no clear command had come to abandon the position? Was it perhaps a kind of resignation, a sense that they had nowhere else to go, no purpose beyond the fortress walls? The town of Saint Nazaire itself, meanwhile, contracted around this German pocket. The civilian population, what remained of it after years of occupation and bombardment, lived in an odd kind of limbo. The war had largely passed them by, and yet they remained in its shadow, in the shadow of the bunker, in the occupied territory of a garrison that the Allies had chosen not to assault. Some civilians had been evacuated, others remained, living their lives in the spaces around the fortress, dealing with German soldiers who were themselves trapped, disconnected from the broader currents of the war. There is a particular poignancy in this moment of history, a town that had suffered bombardment and occupation, waiting now for liberation that was delayed not by German strength, but by a kind of military pragmatism that chose patience over violence. As 1945 arrived and winter deepened, negotiations began, tentatively, between the German commander, a figure about whom the historical record is somewhat sparse, as if the siege itself had rendered individual identity less important than the abstract fact of occupation and the Allied forces surrounding him. These conversations, conducted through intermediaries, were not dramatic in the way that military history often is. They were quiet, slow, conducted in the grey light of February and March, as the war in Europe entered its final months. The German commander, perhaps recognizing the absolute futility of continued resistance, perhaps responding to the weight of months of siege and isolation, began to consider the terms of surrender. What must have been running through his mind? The knowledge that Germany itself was collapsing, that armies were advancing from both east and west, that the concrete fortress, so impressive, so heavily built, was now merely a prison of his own making. The decision to surrender was made gradually, it seems, across conversations and meetings, rather than in a single dramatic moment. By May of 1945, as German armies were laying down their weapons across the continent, as Berlin itself was falling to Soviet forces, the garrison at Saint Nazaire finally relinquished the fortress. The precise date varies slightly in different accounts. Some records cite May 5th, others suggest the surrender extended across several days. But by the first full week of May, the bunker fell into Allied hands, not through assault, but through negotiation. German soldiers emerged from the fortress into the pale spring light of the Loire estuary, prisoners now, their long siege at an end. The concrete walls that had been built to shelter U-boats, that had resisted bombing, that had dominated the landscape for years, passed to new hands. The silence that had grown slowly during the months of blockade became now the silence of abandonment, of a fortress stripped of purpose, its war definitively over. For the town of Saint Nazaire, this moment carried a complex weight. Liberation, yes, but liberation from what had become almost a fixture of existence, a strange equilibrium in which the fortress had settled into the landscape like a geological formation, inevitable and immovable. The town emerged from the war damaged, occupied for nearly 5 years, having endured bombardment and siege and the slow weight of German presence. And yet it had also been spared, in some curious way, the final assault that might have reduced it to rubble. The fortress that had been built to project German power had, in its final months, inadvertently protected the town around it by virtue of being so difficult to assault, so expensive in lives to reduce. There is something almost melancholy in this twist of history, a weapon of war becoming, in its defensive isolation, a kind of shield for the very people it had dominated. The war in Europe was drawing toward its inevitable close by the spring of 1944, and in Saint Nazaire, the bunker that had once pulsed with purpose had begun to hollow out from within, as if the very concrete were learning to hold its breath. The last U-boats that would ever shelter inside those vast pens were being recalled north, or lost in the Atlantic, or simply rendered immobile as fuel grew scarce and the German Navy faced choices it could no longer avoid. The submarines came less frequently now, their sorties briefer, their returns uncertain. Where once the pens had housed as many as 14 vessels at various stages of readiness, there were now stretches of empty water, echoing silence under the cathedral-high roof, and the strange acoustic emptiness that only a place designed for movement can possess when the motion stops. The workers and engineers who had labored inside the fortress walls for nearly 3 years began to understand, in the way that people do when survival instinct whispers before reason speaks, that the war was pivoting toward a different conclusion. Maintenance routines that had seemed eternal, the constant checking of valves, the repairs to concrete damaged by the thousands of tons of explosives that had fallen on the roof, the supply lines that kept the bunker fed, these routines began to fragment and slow. There were shortages now, not of concrete, which surrounded everything in indifferent masses, but of fuel, of spare parts, of certainty about what the next order would bring. Some men simply stopped arriving. Others were reassigned to other fortifications along the coast, as the German command reorganized its shrinking defensive perimeter. As the summer of 1944 deepened, the liberation of France accelerated inland, and the Allies began to encircle Brittany and the Atlantic coast. The bunker at Saint Nazaire, once the jewel of the U-boat arms infrastructure on the western seaboard, became something else entirely. Not a fortress, but a pocket, an isolated position, a place where German forces would choose to make a stand, even as the wider war collapsed around them. The decision was made, in meetings far from the concrete walls, to hold Saint Nazaire rather than abandon it. This meant, in effect, that the port and its massive defensive structure would remain under German control even after the bulk of France had been liberated, even after Paris had fallen, even after the great momentum of the Allied advance had swept past and left Saint Nazaire behind, like a stone in a river. One might wonder, in the slow hours before sleep arrives, what silence sounds like in a space engineered to contain violence and industry at the largest possible scale. The pens themselves, those 14 vast chambers with their roof nearly 7 meters thick, began to fall quiet in ways they never had before. Submarine engines ceased their rumble. The welding torches that had been almost constant through the night hours fell dark. The air, which had carried the tang of diesel and metal and salt water and human effort, began to settle into something heavier and more still. The echo that returned when a voice was raised sounded not like the return of sound, but like the bunker remembering sound, replaying it from memory. The German garrison, reduced and somber, began to prepare the fortress not for attack, but for siege. Anti-tank obstacles were arranged in and around the port. Minefields were expanded. The bunker itself, however, needed no improvement. It had been built to withstand far worse than anything the Allies could now bring to bear, and besides, there was nowhere else to go. Some accounts suggest that the German commander and his officers knew, with a clarity born of watching the war's momentum shift decisively, that this would be a final holding action. Not a victory to be claimed, but a deadline to be honored, a flag to be flown over concrete that had been poured in defiance and now stood witness to that defiance's undoing. As autumn approached, the encirclement tightened. The Allies, having swept across France, were moving up the Atlantic coast, securing ports, pushing German forces into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. Saint Nazaire was surrounded by October, cut off by sea and land, supplied only by irregular blockade runners and submarines that could no longer guarantee safe passage. The bunker fell into a strange state of waiting, still defended, still garrisoned, but no longer essential to any strategy that remained viable. The men inside it were, in a sense, already ghosts, though they were very much alive and alert, watching the bunker's entrances, maintaining its defenses, following orders that came from a high command that was itself retreating into desperation. Consider the peculiar psychology of such a moment. To be inside a structure that represents the height of military engineering prowess, surrounded by meters of reinforced concrete and steel, yet to understand, with a certainty that required no special intelligence, that the larger cause for which one fought had already been decided. The bunker was no longer a weapon, or even a strategic asset. It had become a symbol, and symbols are a different kind of thing entirely. They have no tactical value. They cannot win wars. They can only represent something to those who see them, and hope that the representation is worth more than the cost of maintaining it. The winter of 1944 into 1945 was harsh and wet, as winters are along the Atlantic coast of France. Rain fell on the bunker's vast roof, and the water drained away into gutters and channels engineered decades earlier, when the structure was still imagined to be the fortress that would hold forever. Inside, the German garrison endured shortages and cold, and the psychological weight of knowing that their isolation was now complete. No relief was coming, no reinforcements, no final miracle of technology or strategy. The U-boats that had once made the bunker the center of a global campaign were scattered or sunken, their captains dead or captured, or sailing toward ports that no longer existed as German possessions. The fortress was full of concrete and emptiness in equal measure. As the winter deepened and spring came slowly to the Atlantic coast, the Allies made no aggressive move against the bunker itself. Why should they? It could be contained, starved, observed and waited out. The German garrison could not escape, could not reinforce, could do nothing but hold a position that became more meaningless with each passing day. The concrete walls, which had absorbed thousands of tons of explosives, and endured where wooden structures and earthen fortifications had crumbled, now stood guard over nothing in particular. The pens were empty, the water inside them was still and dark. The echoes of the war machine had faded into ordinary maritime silence. By May 1945, when the war in Europe finally ceased, St Nazaire was among the last French territories still under German control. The surrender came on the 8th of May, and with it came the end of the garrison's strange vigil. The German forces laid down their arms. The bunker was entered by Allied troops, and what had been sealed and secret for nearly 5 years was suddenly open to inspection and documentation. The submarines were gone. The workforce was dispersed. The purpose that had driven construction and maintenance and defense had evaporated like morning mist off the Loire estuary. The silence that fell inside the bunker when the war ended was not the silence of peace, but the silence of cessation, the stopping of a machine, not because it had completed its task, but because the fuel had run out and the next order would never come. 14 empty pens, 14 chambers of reinforced concrete that had been designed to shelter instruments of war and now sheltered nothing but air and darkness and the slow accumulation of stillness. The largest bomb never fell on the bunker's roof. The greatest challenge it faced was not fire or explosives or the ingenuity of its enemies, but the simple fact that the war had moved on without it, leaving it standing intact but obsolete, a fortress with no war to fight, a monument to engineering precision in service of a cause that had collapsed into history. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the bunker at Saint Nazaire stood much as it had stood for 4 years, immense, largely intact, and suddenly purposeless. The submarines were gone. The U-boats had slipped away or been scuttled by their own crews as the Third Reich collapsed. The pens, those vast cathedral spaces of reinforced concrete, echoed now with only the drip of water and the settling of a structure designed to outlast empires, now facing an uncertain peace. The question that began to occupy the minds of planners and engineers across the liberated Atlantic coast was deceptively simple. What does one do with a fortress built for a war that has ended? For the bunker at Saint Nazaire, that question would take years to answer, and the answers themselves would shift with the seasons and the changing moods of a nation learning, slowly, to remember what peace felt like. The immediate impulse, born perhaps from the raw memories of occupation and bombardment, was destruction. French officials and military planners surveyed the massive structure with something between pragmatism and vengeance. Here stood a monument to German engineering and ambition, a scar on the landscape that no one seemed quite ready to carry into the future. Demolition proposals circulated through administrative channels in Paris and in the offices of Saint Nazaire's provisional government. The bunker could be destroyed, it was argued, reduced to rubble by controlled explosives, by salvage operations, by the simple erasure of concrete and steel. Surely that was the proper response. Surely the town deserved to be freed from this shadow. Yet as those proposals moved from desk to desk, a quiet realization began to settle among the engineers and demolition experts who actually examined the structure in detail. The roof of the bunker, that masterwork of wartime engineering which had resisted months of Allied bombing campaigns, was not so easily demolished as imagined. The layers of reinforced concrete, the precision with which the steel had been embedded, the sheer mass of the thing, perhaps 7 meters thick in places, meant that destroying it would be a far more complex, dangerous, and expensive operation than simply ordering its removal. Explosives would be required, the operation would take months, the cost would be considerable, and the disruption to the port, to the town's efforts at reconstruction, could be severe. What had been built to endure now endured, quite simply because enduring was cheaper than removing it. So the fortress remained, and around it, slowly, the life of Saint Nazaire resumed. The town had been devastated by 4 years of occupation and the final battles of liberation. Neighborhoods had been damaged or destroyed. The port infrastructure required rebuilding from the ground up. People returned to streets they thought they might never see again. They began the patient work of restoring homes, of reopening shops, of finding employment and purpose in a landscape transformed by war. The bunker became, in a strange way, less of a presence as time passed. This is perhaps difficult to imagine. How could something so vast grow less visible? But the mind has a way of accepting permanence. What cannot be changed becomes part of the scenery. Workers on the docks began to work beside it without conscious thought. Fishermen moved through the harbour waters beside its massive structure. A generation of children grew up in its shadow and came to see it simply as a part of their town, no more remarkable than a mountain or an old cathedral. Yet the structure did change, if not in form, then in function and meaning. The great pens, those cavernous spaces that had once bustled with the activity of submarine maintenance and repair, began to attract a different kind of attention. The French military established storage facilities within the bunker in the years after the war. Materials were stacked in those vast chambers. The echoing darkness that had once resonated with the voices of German sailors and French conscripted laborers now held supplies, equipment, the mundane necessities of peacetime administration. It was a curious transformation, from weapon to warehouse, from fortress to repository. The tide was beginning to shift, though, in how people thought about such places. Rather than trying to erase the war from the landscape, there emerged across Europe a different impulse, one rooted perhaps in a need to bear witness, to ensure that the weight of those years would not simply vanish. Museums began to appear. Memorials were established. People started to ask whether structures like the bunker at Saint Nazaire might serve a different purpose than destruction or oblivion. Might they serve as teachers? Might the very fact of their survival mean something? By the 1960s and 70s, as Europe had moved further into the post-war period and the immediate trauma of occupation had begun to fade, attitudes toward industrial and military heritage began to shift. The bunker, which had once seemed only a curse and a scar, began to be viewed differently by some, as a historical artifact, as evidence of a particular moment in human ingenuity and ambition, even if that moment had been terrible. This shift did not happen quickly, and it was never universal. There were always those who saw it simply as a reminder of suffering and wanted it gone. But the conversation had begun. The structure continued to stand through the decades. Weather aged it. Salt spray from the Atlantic worked at its surfaces. The concrete that had been poured with such precision and care during wartime weathering began to show its decades. Cracks appeared. Water found its way into spaces it was never meant to penetrate. The bunker, for all its apparent permanence, was subject like all things to time and entropy. But it endured. And as Saint Nazaire itself transformed through the latter half of the 20th century, as it shifted from a purely maritime and industrial economy to one incorporating tourism, cultural renewal, and the careful examination of its own history, the bunker began to acquire a different kind of presence. It was no longer the enemy's weapon or the town's burden. It was becoming, quite slowly and perhaps inevitably, part of the town's story, part of what made Saint Nazaire itself a place worth understanding, worth visiting, worth remembering. The concrete fortress had survived not only bombing and war, but also the more difficult test of peace, the question of what a community does with the monuments of its own suffering. The silence that followed the war, thick, patient, deliberate, lasted for decades. The bunker stood as it had stood, concrete untouched, pens empty, the echoing spaces where submarine crews once moved, now inhabited only by salt air and the slow work of time. For nearly 50 years, Saint Nazaire circled around its fortress like a town unsure whether to embrace or forget what lay at its harbour's edge. The structure remained a scar, undeniable but unaddressed, a monument to an occupation that no one quite knew how to speak about in the bright light of reconstruction. Then, quietly, something shifted. Sometime in the 1990s, conversations began to surface in town halls and among historians, soft at first but gathering weight. What if the bunker, that massive, immovable presence, could become something other than what it had been? Not erased, not hidden beneath water or rubble as some had proposed in those raw post-war years, but transformed, opened, made a place where people could walk through the concrete corridors and understand, truly understand, what had happened beneath that 40-meter roof and why it had mattered to the world. The decision to convert the base into a museum and memorial space was not inevitable, though it seems so now. It required both courage and pragmatism, the courage to face directly the history that lived in those walls, and the pragmatism of recognizing that tourism, education, and remembrance could coexist. The sous-marin Espadon, a real French submarine from the post-war era, was positioned at the harbour approach, a sentinel of sorts, a bridge between the hunter-killers that had once sheltered here and the newer, subtly different vessels that came after. Her presence outside the bunker entrance creates an immediate visual grammar. Here was the vessel form, here was the shelter form. The contrast teaches without words. Inside, the transformation proceeded with considerable care. Modern museums walk a difficult line. They must make historic spaces accessible without rendering them sterile, educational without being didactic, haunting without being exploitative. The Saint Nazaire Bunker Museum seems to have found something like that balance. The concrete walls remain raw, unadorned in many sections, their greyness still speaking of wartime austerity and urgency. But interspersed throughout are exhibits that breathe light into that grey, photographs of workers, their faces captured by whatever cameras existed in occupied France, personal testimonies, voices recorded decades after the war, men and women recounting what it meant to live alongside this structure, to build it, to fear it, to see it cratered by bombs that bounced off like so many stones. There are technical diagrams too, but they're framed not as abstract engineering puzzles, but as evidence of human ingenuity applied to survival, even if that survival was in service of a cause most now regard with historical horror. The acoustic properties of the bunker, which once served as an advantage for the German crews, sounds travelling in particular ways, allowing for communication and surveillance, now serve the museum's purposes differently. A recorded voice in one pen carries weight, presence, authority. You can stand where submarine commanders stood, hear the hollow echo of footsteps on the same concrete, understand viscerally the isolation and the scale. Some visitors report feeling something akin to vertigo in those spaces, not from height but from depth, from the sheer heaviness of the structure overhead and the weight of what occurred within. As the 2000s progressed, the harbour around the bunker began its own quiet revolution. Saint Nazaire, like many European port towns, had faced the post-industrial question: what becomes of a town when its primary industries shift? Shipbuilding had largely moved or vanished. But a port city has water, history, space, and if those are stewarded thoughtfully, they become cultural assets. The bunker became a centerpiece of that regeneration, not as a museum in isolation, but as part of a larger narrative about the harbour's identity. The harbour itself was reimagined, walkways installed, vistas opened. The relationship between visitor and water fundamentally altered. Where once access to the waterfront was restricted, now it's invited. Around the fortress, other cultural venues began to cluster. A newer maritime museum, separate from the bunker facility itself but in conversation with it, opened to chronicle the broader story of the harbour, the shipbuilding dynasties, the merchant vessels, the fishing boats, the interplay of commerce and conflict that had always defined the place. Art installations, some permanent, many temporary, began to appear on the grounds. A few artists have worked directly with the bunker's visual language, its austere geometry, creating pieces that acknowledge, rather than resist, the historical weight. There's something both haunting and appropriate about contemporary art existing in dialogue with a World War II fortress, as if the present is having a quiet conversation with the past, not denying it, not erasing it, but integrating it into an ongoing cultural conversation. The museum operation itself became sophisticated. Guided tours, some in French, some in English, some in other languages, are led by people trained not just in historical facts, but in what you might call ethical interpretation, the ability to present difficult history with nuance, to avoid both celebration and melodrama. There are school groups, which raises its own questions and sensitivities. How do you teach children about the U-boat campaign, about occupation, about the moral complexities of technological warfare, without either traumatizing them or oversimplifying into villain and hero narratives? The museum appears to take that challenge seriously, offering different levels of engagement, different narrative frames depending on age and context. One might wonder whether opening the bunker to tourism somehow diminishes its historical weight, whether the sound of footsteps and the whispered conversations of visitors detract from the gravity of what the space represents. Some visitors report the opposite, that walking through surrounded by other people, ordinary people from around the world, creates a strange democracy of understanding. A schoolchild from Germany, a retiree from Belgium, a young couple from Australia, all standing together in a submarine pen that once housed instruments of war. There's something almost redemptive about that mixing, not redemptive in a religious sense but in a human sense. The space becomes a place where history is shared, rather than possessed by any single nation or narrative. The bunker's role has also evolved into a venue for cultural events, exhibitions on Allied resistance movements, on the German occupation, on the technological arms race beneath the Atlantic surface. Theatre performances, in some cases, have been staged within the concrete spaces, using the architecture as a character itself. Concerts too. Classical musicians drawn to the acoustic properties of the pens, the way sound travels and resonates through chambers designed for purposes entirely remote from music. There's something poignant about a cello's voice echoing through a structure built for secrecy and violence, now repurposed as a space for art and contemplation. The memorial function persists throughout, however, never subordinated to tourism or entertainment. Plaques mark the names of workers who died during construction. A section of the museum is dedicated to the human cost of the base's operation, both to the German military and to those who resisted it. Flowers are sometimes left at particular spots, markers of private grief or public remembrance that continue even as the decades multiply away from the war itself. The museum staff seems to understand that a space like this operates simultaneously as historical document, spiritual site, and testimony to the living and the dead. Perhaps most quietly, the bunker's existence as museum and cultural space has allowed St Nazaire itself to recover a kind of narrative coherence. The fortress that once divided the town, spatially, psychologically, morally, has become the center of an identity that includes that difficult history but is not consumed by it. People work in the harbour, walk along the waterfront, visit the museum, have coffee in restaurants that face the water, and the bunker stands above all of it, no longer a living threat, but a keeper of memory, a teacher of hard truths, a reminder that the natural world, the granite rocks, the flowing tides, persists indifferently through human conflict and human recovery alike. And so the Loire runs on, as it has for millennia, carrying its grey-green waters past the place where empires rose and fell within a single lifetime. The bunker stands still. Its concrete has aged to a softer grey now, weathered by salt wind and Atlantic rain, by the passage of 75 years of seasons that ask nothing of stone and ask nothing of memory. On quiet nights, when the port sleeps and the fishing boats rest in their moorings, you might imagine that the fortress has learned to breathe differently, not with the urgency of wartime, but with the measured rhythm of a place that has outlasted its original purpose, and in outlasting it, discovered something almost like peace. The architecture of remembrance is a strange thing. When humans build to destroy, to shelter weapons, to protect instruments of war, they build with a permanence they rarely intend. The very thickness of that roof, that impenetrable ceiling of steel and reinforced concrete that no bomb could pierce, has become the thickest statement about the war's ending. It endures, not because anyone wished it to endure, but because concrete is patient. Concrete is longer lived than the men who poured it. It is longer lived than the ideology that demanded it. It is longer lived than the submarines that once moved through those flooded pens like grey ghosts through a grey cathedral, and it is longer lived than the fear that those submarines carried across the Atlantic. There is something worth sitting with in that silence. When you walk through Saint Nazaire today, moving through streets where bombardment and occupation left their marks, where the newer buildings stand alongside survivors from before the war, the bunker rises not as a monument to German engineering or to Nazi ambition, but as something more honest, a monument to the fact that things end. The submarines are gone. The U-boat crews have aged beyond memory or passed into it. The tonnage of ships sunk in the Atlantic has become a statistic, abstracted and historical. But the concrete remains. It is the most straightforward thing in the harbour, not claiming victory, not claiming defeat, simply standing, simply being built, simply persisting in the way that stone persists. The town itself has done the harder work of transformation. A military port became a civilian one again. The rubble of bombardment was cleared away. Families returned to neighborhoods where basements had served as bomb shelters. Children were born in houses that had known occupation. The port that once hummed with the machinery of war, with the discipline of German logistics, with the desperate invention required to keep the Atlantic campaign alive, became a port of ordinary commerce again. Fishing vessels, container ships, the rhythms of trade that ask no questions about whose hands built the infrastructure, or why, or what they were building for. And yet the bunker remains visible. This is perhaps the gift of architecture. It cannot lie. It cannot reinterpret itself. It can only stand as a physical reminder of what was built and when and why. Those 14 pens, sealed now or open to the light in controlled ways, speak in the language of concrete about the logic of a specific moment in history. They tell you something about resource allocation and engineering ambition. They tell you something about the relationship between protection and aggression. They tell you something about the particular terror of the Atlantic War, where the ocean itself became a battlefield, and the technologies of modern warfare were still learning to balance force with the fragility of human life. To walk through those pens now, to see the names of submarines recorded on plaques, to understand that young men, many of them conscripted, many of them uncertain about the cause they served, operated within these concrete walls, is to feel the weight of history in a way that no textbook can quite convey. And yet it is a weight that the place itself seems to have learned to carry with a certain grace. The fortress that was built to serve war now serves understanding. It is a classroom. It is a place of pilgrimage. It is a place where visitors from many nations stand and think about what was lost, what was risked, what was built, and what was eventually abandoned. There is a meditation to be found in that, in the idea that the most durable things, the buildings, the structures, the physical manifestations of human will, outlast the purposes for which they were made. The bunker at St Nazaire was built as a weapon system. It was built as part of an industrial apparatus. It was built with the full weight of state machinery and engineering expertise and human labor, much of it coerced. And today it stands as something entirely different. It stands as evidence. It stands as a question mark. It stands as a space where people can think about the complexity of history, the way that systems of war involve the participation of millions, engineers and workers and soldiers and civilians, all of them caught in currents larger than themselves. The Loire continues to flow. The seasons continue to turn. Winter brings its grey light to the bunker's massive walls, and the water that surrounds it in the harbour reflects the sky. Spring brings something almost tender to the port, new growth along the waterfront, restoration and rebuilding happening in the margins around that immovable grey presence. Summer brings visitors, and their footsteps echo through corridors that once echoed with the voices of men preparing for patrols, preparing to sail into danger, preparing for operations whose consequences rippled across an entire ocean and reached into countless lives they would never see. And autumn returns, as autumn always does, bringing the mist back to the Loire, bringing that softening of light at dawn and dusk that makes the bunker seem less like a fortress and more like something that has simply become part of the landscape, the way a mountain becomes part of the landscape, the way a coastline becomes part of the landscape, the way that time and weather and the simple passage of millions of individual days can begin to transform even the most aggressively built human structure into something that simply is. What does a place learn from serving war? Perhaps it learns that nothing is permanent. Perhaps it learns that the greatest strength lies not in endurance through conflict, but in the capacity to transform, to become something new, to hold memory without being imprisoned by it. The bunker at Saint Nazaire holds memory in its concrete. It holds the memory of decision and design, of labor and logistics, of young men and their submarines, of a particular moment in the 20th century when the Atlantic became a battlefield and victory seemed always one battle away. And then that moment passed. The war ended. The submarines were scuttled or sailed into captivity. The men aged and died and lived their lives after. The port returned to the ordinary work of being a port. The town returned to the ordinary work of being a town. And the bunker stood still, gradually being weathered by salt and time, gradually being recontextualized by memory and historical distance. Not destroyed, for destruction was attempted and failed, but slowly absorbed into the landscape, slowly becoming less the symbol of German power and more the symbol of the war itself, in all its enormous weight and complexity. This is the quiet work of time. This is what survives when empires do not triumph, not vindication, not even, ultimately, the memory of individual moments, though moments matter, and the bunker holds those moments in its structure. What survives is the thing itself, the physical fact of what was built, the invitation it extends to future generations to look, to question, to understand, to see the war not as abstraction, but as something that was once concrete and specific and real. And so we leave it now, as the night deepens around the harbour. The bunker stands in darkness, as it stands in daylight. The water laps at its walls,